You're listening to Midnight Whispers Stories. Tonight's stories come from Alaska, a place where distance, silence, and isolation behave differently than anywhere else in America. This channel focuses on true psychological horror told calmly, without exaggeration, built around real places and real isolation. If you're looking for long-form horror with a consistent atmosphere and regular releases, subscribe to Midnight Whispers Stories. Story 1. Road that didn't T-connect. I still hear the scraping at night. That low, deliberate sound of something metal dragging across asphalt in complete darkness. My therapist says it was trauma manifesting as auditory hallucinations, but she wasn't there on that highway in Alaska, where the road existed but didn't feel connected to anything else. Where distance behaves differently, where something was waiting that shouldn't exist at all. It started 3 months ago when I took a contract job surveying abandoned infrastructure in the Northern Territories. The pay was exceptional, the kind of money that makes you ignore the warning signs. I am a civil engineer from Seattle, 42 years old, divorced, no kids. The kind of guy who thought he understood risk because he decalculated load-bearing capacities and stress fractures for 20 years. I was wrong about what risk actually meant. The assignment seemed straightforward. Document a series of forgotten roads built during the Cold War, relics from when paranoia drove us to construct emergency routes through the Alaskan wilderness. Most had been reclaimed by nature or officially decommissioned, but one remained on old government maps with a designation that made no sense: Highway 949. No connection to any numbered route system. No towns along its path, just a line drawn through empty space on outdated charts. My first mistake was going alone. The locals in the last real town, a dying collection of buildings called Kettleman, warned me not to bother. An old man at the gas station, face weathered like driftwood, looked at my route map and actually stepped back. His reaction wasn't fear exactly. It was recognition, like he'd seen that map before, held by people who never came back to show it to him again. "That road don't go nowhere," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "More important, nowhere don't want you finding it." I should have listened. Instead, I laughed it off as small-town superstition, filled my tank, bought extra supplies, and headed north into the wilderness where cell service became a memory and the sky pressed down like a physical weight. The landscape up there rewrites your sense of scale. Mountains that look an hour away remain on the horizon after 6 hours of driving. The forests are so dense and dark they seem to absorb light rather than merely block it. And the silence. God, the silence was terrifying in a way I couldn't articulate. Not peaceful, hungry. I found Highway 949 exactly where the coordinates indicated, marked by a rusted, bullet-riddled sign so faded I could barely read the numbers. The road itself looked maintained, which was the first truly unsettling detail. Smooth asphalt, relatively new, with fresh yellow lines despite being officially abandoned for decades. Someone had been keeping this road operational. But who? And more disturbingly, why? The highway cut straight through terrain that seemed to resist it. Trees grew right to the edge, their branches hanging over the pavement like grasping fingers. No shoulder, no turnoffs, just this perfect ribbon of road extending into the distance with an unnatural straightness that defied the mountainous geography around it. I drove for 40 minutes before noticing something impossible. My odometer showed I'd traveled 38 miles, but when I checked my GPS position, I moved less than 4 miles from where I entered the highway. The device wasn't malfunctioning. It tracked my movement along the road perfectly. The road itself was distorting distance, creating space that shouldn't exist. That's when the fear started crawling up my spine. Real fear, primal and chemical, flooding my system with adrenaline that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. This wasn't just an abandoned road. It was something else entirely. Something that broke fundamental rules about how reality operates. I should have turned around immediately, but professional pride or maybe just stupid human curiosity made me continue. I told myself I needed documentation, photographs, evidence of this anomaly. The truth is darker. Part of me wanted to see where this impossible highway led. What lay at the end of a road that didn't connect to anything? The sun began setting earlier than it should have. I entered the highway at 2 in the afternoon, driven for maybe 90 minutes, but the light was already dying like evening at 7. Time was wrong here too. Moving at a different speed, following different laws. That's when I saw the first car. It sat perfectly centered in my lane about a quarter mile ahead. An old sedan from the 70s, brown paint oxidized to a dull rust color. As I approached, slowing down, I could see it was empty. Doors closed, windows intact, just sitting there in the middle of this haunted highway like someone had parked it carefully and walked away into the trees. I stopped about 50 feet back, engine running, every instinct screaming at me to reverse and flee. But I couldn't, because when I looked in my rearview mirror, the road behind me had changed. The pavement I'd just driven over was now cracked and broken, consumed by vegetation, looking decades abandoned. The way forward past the sedan remained pristine and new. The highway was closing behind me, forcing me in one direction, toward something. I sat there for several minutes, breathing hard, trying to logic my way through a situation that defied logic. Then I heard it for the first time. That scraping sound, metal on asphalt, coming from somewhere ahead, beyond the abandoned car. Slow, methodical, getting louder. I'd never believed in the supernatural. I am an engineer. I deal with concrete reality, physics, measurable phenomena. But in that moment, listening to that sound approach through the dying light on an impossible road in the Alaskan wilderness, I understood that belief doesn't matter. Some things exist whether you accept them or not. The scraping stopped. Silence fell again, somehow worse than the sound. I made a decision born of pure panic. I swerved around the abandoned sedan and accelerated hard, desperate to reach whatever endpoint this highway had before full darkness arrived. More cars appeared, dozens of them, all different makes and models spanning decades. All empty, all positioned in the lanes like they'd been driven there deliberately and abandoned. Some were recent, paint still shiny, temporary tags in the windows. Others were ancient, barely recognizable as vehicles anymore. A timeline of disappearances stretching back to when this road was first built. The horror of understanding hit me like cold water. This highway didn't just distort space and time. It collected, it gathered. Every person who'd driven this route looking for answers or adventure or just taking a wrong turn. All of them still here somewhere, changed into something that scraped metal across asphalt and the darkness. I was driving 70 miles per hour on a road that shouldn't exist, surrounded by vehicles belonging to people who made the same mistake I had, and ahead of me, finally, I saw the end. Not a town, not a connection to another highway, just a place where the asphalt stopped abruptly at the edge of a massive crater in the earth. The road literally led to nowhere, a perfect circle of darkness descending into the ground, so deep my headlights couldn't find the bottom. I slammed the brakes, stopping inches from the edge, and that is when I saw them. Figures standing around the perimeter of the crater. Dozens of them, human-shaped but wrong in ways my mind refused to fully process. Too tall, too thin, moving with a jerking, mechanical quality like their joints bent in extra places. They were the people from the cars, what the highway had turned them into. Changed, transformed, absorbed into whatever this place was. And they were watching me with something that might have been curiosity or hunger or just cold recognition. Another one had arrived, another traveler on the road that didn't connect to anything. The scraping sound started again, all around me now. They were dragging pieces of metal, parts of cars, across the highway. Creating that sound, calling to something down in that crater. Something that lived beneath this haunted stretch of Alaskan wilderness. Something that needed the road to feed. I remember making the conscious decision. Survival instinct took over. I threw my truck in reverse and punched the accelerator, flying backward down the highway, not caring if I crashed, just desperate to escape. The figures didn't chase me. They just watched with their wrong, elongated bodies silhouetted against the dying light. The road behind me had reopened. I don't know how or why. Maybe it wasn't done feeding. Maybe I wasn't worth keeping. I reversed for miles until I could finally turn around, then drove faster than I'd ever driven, tears streaming down my face, laughing and sobbing simultaneously like a person losing their mind. I hit the entrance to Highway 949 as full night arrived and nearly destroyed my truck getting back onto the previous road. But I made it. I escaped. I drove all night back to Kettleman, where the old man at the gas station took one look at me and just nodded slowly. He'd seen that expression before, on the few who made it back. I filed my report. I included everything. The impossible distance distortion, the abandoned vehicles, the crater, the figures. The company terminated my contract immediately and made me sign documents I barely read. Later, I tried to find Highway 949 on maps, satellite imagery, anything. It doesn't appear anywhere. Like it never existed. Like it exists somewhere between real and unreal, catching people who wander into that space. But sometimes late at night, I hear that scraping sound, and I wonder if I really escaped, or if part of me is still on that highway, driving toward the crater, joining the collection of travelers who took a road that didn't connect to anything, who found the nowhere that was waiting for them. In Alaska, distance behaves differently. Roads can exist without connecting, and some destinations aren't places at all, but transformations. The highway is still there, still waiting, still gathering, and the terrifying truth is that it is not the only one. There are other roads like it scattered across empty places in America. Other highways that don't appear on maps. Other collections of abandoned cars and changed people. You just have to be unlucky enough to find them. To take that turn onto pavement that looks maintained but feels wrong. To drive into the darkness where distance stops making sense and you realize too late that you left the world of normal roads and entered something much older and infinitely more hungry. I still hear the scraping. Every night. Getting closer. Story 2. Sound that died in Alaska. I should have turned back at the Fairbanks diner when the waitress grabbed my wrist. But I didn't. I was 37 years old, driving alone through Alaska on the worst decision of my life. And I didn't yet understand what silence really meant. The highway stretched empty before me. Not empty like a normal road. Empty like the world had forgotten itself. I was heading to Stillwater, a small town about 4 hours north of Fairbanks that I could read about online. A remote place where an uncle I never met had left me a house. A house worth money. Enough that I quit my job in Seattle, packed my truck, and driven up here in late September when the season was already turning dangerous. What kind of person does that? A desperate one. A lonely one. A man who believed that running north would somehow put distance between himself and his failures. The creepy settled in around mile marker 234. First, I noticed my radio didn't work. Nothing unusual in Alaska, I'd been told. These remote roads had dead zones. But as I twisted through the stations, I didn't get the familiar screech of static between channels. Instead, I got nothing. Dead air. It was like the radio had been unplugged from the universe itself. Then I noticed the birds. Alaska is loud. Anyone who tells you otherwise hasn't been there. Eagles, ravens, the constant chatter of smaller birds. They everywhere, especially in the fall when they preparing to migrate. But the closer I got to Stillwater, the quieter everything became. At first, I told myself the sound was just fading as I drove deeper into the remote interior. But that wasn't it. It was something else, something terrifying. The silence was wrong. It felt intentional. I should have been scared then. Looking back, I realized that was my last good chance to turn around. But fear doesn't always work that way. Sometimes fear just makes you curious. Sometimes it makes you want to see the thing you're afraid of, to know what is waiting. That is what happened to me. The highway began to change. The trees grew denser, taller, their branches reaching toward the road like skeletal fingers. The autumn colors had turned muted, almost grayscale. Everything looked drained of life, as if something was slowly pulling the color from the world. The eerie landscape stretched on for hours. No other cars, no sign of human existence. Just me, my truck, and the terrible silence that pressed against my eardrums like water at the bottom of the ocean. I passed a sign for Stillwater, population 847. The number seemed arbitrary, meaningless, like it hadn't been updated in decades. Below the town name, someone had painted a second line. Sound doesn't travel here. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. A warning painted on a road sign. Not a joke, not a metaphor, a warning about the actual physical properties of the place I was driving toward. That was when I saw the first house. It was set back from the road about 50 yards, a cabin with rotting wood siding and windows dark as closed eyes. The roof had caved in on one side, but what caught my attention wasn't the decay. It was the perfectly neat stack of firewood beside it. Stacked just months ago. Someone had been here recently, and then they stopped. More houses appeared as I drove deeper. A small cluster of them, maybe 5 or 6, all with that same unsettling combination of abandonment and maintenance. Gardens grown wild but with fence posts that looked freshly repaired. Chimneys dark and cold, but driveways recently swept clean of snow. The road took me through the main part of town. Stillwater, This downtown was maybe 4 blocks long. A general store with dusty windows. A small church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the left. A gas station that looked like it hadn't sold fuel in years. And everywhere, that same terrifying quiet. I pulled into the driveway of the house that supposedly belonged to me now. It was larger than the others, a 2-story Victorian-style place painted a faded yellow. The front porch sagged. The mailbox hung from a single nail, but the walk had been shoveled recently. My heart was doing strange things in my chest. That creepy feeling had transformed into something closer to actual horror. I was scared now, genuinely, deeply scared, but I forced myself out of the truck. The cold was immediate and absolute. Not the normal cold of Alaska, this interior, but something worse. Something that seemed to reach through my coat and grab my lungs. I tried to call out, testing my voice. I said, "Hello." Nothing. No echo. No sound carrying through the air. It was like the word had died the moment it left my mouth, absorbed into the snow and the silence before it could travel even 20 feet. The creepy truth I read on that warning sign was becoming real. Sound didn't to carry here. Voices died. Help wouldn't to come. I tried again. Louder. "Hello? Is anyone here?" The silence swallowed the words whole. I am trained as a software engineer. I think in logic and systems. But standing there in that yard, I understood something that no amount of rational thinking could explain away. There was something wrong with this place on a fundamental level. Not just wrong like a haunted house from a movie. Wrong like the laws of physics themselves had been broken. Inside the house, the air was stale and cold. Dust covered everything, but not evenly. Recent footprints marked the hardwood floors. Someone had been walking through this house. Regularly, recently. But the house had no power. No water running. The electricity had been cut off decades ago. The photographs were what really did it. In the living room, on the walls and shelves, there were hundreds of photographs. All from different eras. A family in the 1950s standing in front of the same house. A couple from the 1970s in the same living room. Individual portraits spanning every decade from the 1940s to the present day. And in every single photograph, everyone, the people's mouths were sewn shut. Not crudely, not in a way that suggested violence. The stitching was neat, professional, done with surgical precision. Black thread, even spacing, like someone had carefully, deliberately, over decades, collected images of people whose mouths had been sealed. The nightmare was becoming coherent. I found a journal in the kitchen drawer. The first entry was dated March 1987. The sound stopped today. I called out to Margaret, but my voice didn't reach her across the room. She called back. I couldn't to hear her. The snow must have gotten too deep. It's absorbing everything now. I should leave, but I don't to know if I could find the road if the silence was following me. The entries continued, different handwriting sometimes, different people, all describing the same horrifying phenomenon. The sound dying, communication ending, and then something worse. Something about people arriving in the night. Something about procedures, about mouths that needed to be sealed because sound was dangerous here. Sound could kill you. The last entry, dated just 2 weeks ago, was written in shaky handwriting. 43 years. That kept the sound dead for 43 years. The newcomer arrived yesterday. He doesn't know yet. The snow will teach him. The silence will teach him. And when he understands, he'll understand why his mouth needs to be sealed too. We all serve the quiet now. We are quiet. We are safe. I should have run. The terrifying part is that I almost did. I stood in that kitchen, shaking, reading those final words, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to get back to my truck and drive. But something stopped me. A thought, a horrible realization. If sound didn't to carry here, then whoever wrote that journal wouldn't have been able to hear me arrive. They wouldn't know I was there. But I'd been in the town for almost 2 hours now. And I hadn't seen anyone. No one had come to greet me or warn me or seal my mouth shut. So either the journal was old, and whatever had happened here had ended long ago, or the town had learned to work in absolute silence. That's when I heard it, or rather, when I felt it, a vibration. Not sound, but something underneath sound. Something that traveled through the house itself, through the floorboards and the walls. A rhythm, regular, purposeful, like a heartbeat. It was coming from the basement. The door was in the kitchen corner. I almost missed it. It was painted the same color as the wall, making it nearly invisible. The handle was cold, colder than anything in that house had a right to be. The stairs went down into darkness. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to see the space below. It was enormous, larger than the house above it. And it was full of people. I don't know how many. Dozens, maybe hundreds. They were standing in rows, perfectly still, perfectly silent. And every single one of them had something covering their mouth. Some had neat surgical stitches like in the photographs. Others had what looked like tape. Some had bandages. Some had things that looked like locked iron covers, bolted directly to their faces. And they were all looking directly at me. My hand went to my mouth. I felt the thin line of my lips, the place where they soon begin their work. I understood finally what my uncle's inheritance had been. Not a house, a test, a way to bring fresh meat into the terrifying place where sound had died. A place where silence was enforced not because it was peaceful, but because something ancient and horrible lived here, and noise disturbed it. I ran. I tried to scream, but even my scream died before it reached my own ears. I could feel the sound leaving my mouth, but I couldn't hear it. The scream was there, real and desperate, but it hit the heavy, snow-laden air and simply ceased to exist. The front door locked behind me. I didn't lock it. It just did. The creepy truth was that I was already trapped. Had been since I entered the town limits, since the moment the silence had wrapped around my truck like chains. I drove toward the town limits, but the road curved. It curved again, and again. I passed houses I recognized and then passed them a second time. The road wasn't going forward. It was going in circles. The snow was falling harder now, thick and heavy, and it was accumulating on my windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. The white flakes were absorbing any sound my engine made, swallowing the only noise that still worked in this place. I've been driving in Stillwater for what feels like days now. But I don't think it's been more than a few hours. Time moves differently here, slower, or maybe just less certain. I can feel them behind me, the people from the basement, walking silently through the snow, their mouths sealed, their footsteps making no sound. They patient. They have decades of practice waiting for new arrivals. My throat hurts. I think that's where it starts. The scratching in your throat when you try to make sound in a place where sound doesn't exist. Soon it will feel infected. Then it will feel wrong. And then you'll understand why sealing your mouth is easier than trying to speak in a place that has learned to swallow all words. I can see a figure ahead on the road, just standing there, waiting. Its mouth is covered with something that catches the truck, whose headlights and gleams. I am going to crash the truck now. I think that was the plan all along. New people always crash near the edge of town. The collision always seals something inside them, something that makes them finally understand, something that makes them stop trying to call for help. I can feel my mouth going numb. Soon I want to need the stitches. I'll just accept it. We all do, eventually. Sound doesn't carry in Stillwater. And after a while, neither do we. The population was never really 847. It's much larger than that now. All of us here, all the arrivals, all the people the silence taught to be quiet. We exist in the spaces between sound. And we're always looking for the next person who thinks they can hear, who thinks they can call out, who thinks that help will come. There is no help. There is only silence. There is only the snow that falls and falls and falls, absorbing every word, every scream, every desperate prayer into its infinite white nothing. I see the figure clearly now. Its mouth is covered with black thread, stitched in that neat, surgical way. It's smiling underneath the stitches. It's been waiting for me. They've all been waiting. And now, finally, I understand why my uncle left me this house. Why he let me inherit this place. Because inheritance, real inheritance, is something we pass on to new arrivals. Something we give them because we received it ourselves. The truck is hitting the snowbank now. I can feel it, even if I can hear it. The metal crunching without sound. The impact sending through my body in perfect, beautiful silence. Soon I want to try to speak anymore. Soon I'll be like the others. Soon I'll be part of Stillwater, this true population. The one that lives in the spaces between words. The one that understands that some places don't want sound. Some places want only the dead, hollow silence of snow that never echoes and voices that never carry. And the creepy part, the thing that really gets me even now, is that I am almost relieved. The silence is peaceful once you stop fighting it. And I've been fighting for so long. These stories take place in Alaska, where help is never close and silence carries weight. If this kind of psychological horror works for you, subscribe to Midnight Whispers Stories. Subscribing means you'll always have access to long-form Alaskan stories, a consistent tone, and new episodes you can return to without searching. Story 3. Cabin with the lights still on. I found a cabin in the Alaskan wilderness with every light burning bright, heat pouring from the vents, coffee still warm on the counter, and absolutely no one inside. That was 3 weeks ago. I still do not know if I should have walked away. My name is Marcus, and I work as a utility inspector for the Rural Power Company in northern Alaska. My job takes me to some of the most isolated places in America, checking meters and power lines in areas where neighbors might be 20 miles apart and winter darkness swallows the land for months at a time. I have seen plenty of strange things out here: abandoned homesteads, cabins left to rot, equipment that stops working for no reason. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I discovered on that freezing February afternoon. The work order seemed routine. A remote cabin near Coldfoot was showing unusual power consumption. The meters indicated someone was running electricity 24 hours a day, burning through kilowatts like the place was lit up for Christmas. Corporate wanted me to check it out, make sure there was not a fault in the line or some kind of theft situation. I loaded my truck with gear, called my wife to tell her I would be back late, and headed north on the Dalton Highway as the sun made its brief appearance above the horizon. The drive took 4 hours. The landscape out there is terrifying in its emptiness. Mile after mile of snow-covered spruce forest, mountains that look like teeth against the gray sky, and a silence so complete it makes your ears ring. I passed maybe 3 other vehicles the entire trip. The highway stretched ahead like a wound cut through the wilderness, and I remember thinking how easy it would be to just disappear out here. How many people had vanished in these woods and never been found? I turned off onto a service road around 2 in the afternoon. The GPS coordinates led me deeper into the trees, following tire tracks that looked a few days old. Snow had drifted across the path in places, and my truck bounced over frozen ruts that threatened to snap an axle. I was starting to wonder if I had taken a wrong turn when I saw it through the trees. The cabin sat in a small clearing, and every single window blazed with light. Not just a lamp or two. Every window, upstairs, downstairs, what looked like the basement. Golden light poured out into the blue twilight, creating long shadows across the snow. Smoke rose from the chimney. I could hear the hum of a generator from somewhere behind the structure. The whole place looked warm and alive and inhabited, like someone was expecting guests for dinner. I parked my truck and grabbed my toolkit and clipboard. My breath formed clouds in the air as I walked toward the front door. The snow crunched under my boots, and that was the only sound. No dog barking, no radio playing, no voices, just that unsettling hum of power running through the lines and the whisper of wind through the spruce trees. The front porch had been recently shoveled. A pair of boots sat by the door, dusted with snow. I knocked, loud and clear. The sound echoed in the stillness. I waited, stamping my feet against the cold. Nothing. I knocked again, harder this time, and called out that I was from the power company. Still nothing, but I could feel heat radiating from the door, hear what sounded like a television or radio playing somewhere inside, muffled and indistinct. I tried the doorknob. It turned easily. The door swung open, and warmth rushed out to meet me like a living thing. The interior was almost shocking after hours in the cold. I stepped inside, calling out again, announcing myself. My voice sounded strange in the enclosed space, too loud and too intrusive. The cabin was immaculate. A fire burned in the stone fireplace, logs crackling and sending sparks up the chimney. Every lamp in the living room was on. The television played static on a local channel. The sound turned low. A mug of coffee sat on the kitchen counter, still steaming. I touched it. Hot, fresh, made within the last 10 or 15 minutes. This is when the fear started to creep in. Not scary in an obvious way, but unsettling in a way that made my skin prickle. Someone had just been here, recently, and they had left everything running. Left the door unlocked, left their coffee, just vanished. I moved through the rooms slowly, still calling out, my voice growing less confident with each unanswered shout. The kitchen was clean, dishes stacked neatly by the sink. A pot of something, maybe stew, sat on the stove on low heat. The smell was rich and savory. Dinner, ready and waiting for someone who was not there. Upstairs, both bedrooms had their lights on. The beds were made with military precision. Closets hung with clothes, shoes lined up beneath. In the bathroom, a towel lay draped over the shower rod, still damp. Toothbrushes stood in a cup by the sink. Everything suggested normal life, ordinary routine, people who had just stepped out for a moment and would be right back. But they were not back, and something in the air, something I could not quite name, told me they were not coming back. I went down to the basement. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the temperature dropped as I descended. More lights, a workshop with tools hung on pegboards, a freezer humming in the corner, and something else, something that made me stop halfway down the stairs. Scratches on the walls, deep gouges in the wood, running in parallel lines from the floor to about chest height. They covered the far wall in chaotic patterns, dozens of them, like something had been clawing to get out, or clawing to get in. The fear was not creeping anymore. It was here, cold and heavy in my chest. I reached the bottom of the stairs and approached the wall. The scratches were fresh. Splinters of wood lay on the concrete floor beneath them. I touched one of the gouges. It was deep, carved with force, and there were 4 lines in each group. Like fingers, like something with hands had done this. Behind me, the television upstairs changed. The static cut out, replaced by a voice. I could not make out the words, but the tone was wrong. Distorted. Too slow. I turned and climbed the stairs faster than I should have, my heart hammering, my breath coming quick. The television showed a local news broadcast, but the image was corrupted, bleeding colors and fragmented shapes. The anchor, his voice was pitched low, the words stretched and meaningless. As I stood there watching, the screen flickered and showed something else. A camera feed, black and white, grainy. It showed the living room I was standing in, from an angle high in the corner. The feed was live. I could see myself on the screen, standing there with my toolkit, staring up at the camera I had not noticed. My blood went cold. There were cameras throughout the cabin. Small, discreet, mounted in the corners of every room. I had walked past them without seeing. Someone was watching, or had been watching, recording everything that happened in this place. I moved to the window and looked out at the clearing. My truck sat where I had left it, exhaust still visible in the cold air. The forest pressed in on all sides, dense and dark even in the remaining daylight. Nothing moved out there, but I had the sudden, horrible certainty that I was not alone. That somewhere in those trees, someone was watching me right now. The coffee mug was still on the counter, still steaming. I walked over and looked at it more closely. There was lipstick on the rim, a print in dark red. I had not noticed it before. Next to the mug, a cell phone lay face down. I hesitated, then picked it up. The screen lit up. No passcode. The last thing open was a text message, unsent. The cursor blinking at the end of an incomplete sentence. It read, "They are not what they pretend to be. Do not trust anything you see. If you find this, get out while you can. They are in that." That was it. The message ended there. No name, no contact, just that warning, abandoned mid-sentence, as if the person had been interrupted or taken. My hands were shaking now. I pocketed the phone and moved toward the door. That was when I heard it. A sound from outside, footsteps crunching through snow, slow and deliberate, coming closer. I froze. The footsteps circled the cabin, moving from the front to the side to the back. More than one set, multiple people, walking in sync, their rhythm identical and disturbing in its precision. I crept to the window and peered out through a gap in the curtains. Figures moved through the trees. 4 of them, maybe 5. They wore dark clothing, hoods pulled up, faces hidden in shadow. They walked in a line, evenly spaced, not looking around or searching. Just walking, circling, like they knew exactly where they were going and what they would find. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. The front door was the only exit. If they came in that way, I was trapped. I looked around frantically for another option, the back door in the kitchen. I moved quickly, quietly, trying not to make noise. The back door was locked from the inside. I turned the deadbolt and eased it open. Cold air rushed in. The backyard was empty, but I could hear the footsteps still circling. Getting closer. I stepped out into the snow and pulled the door shut behind me. The forest was only 20 feet away. I ran for it, my boots sinking into the deep snow, my breath tearing at my lungs. Behind me, I heard the front door of the cabin open. Voices called out, flat and emotionless, words I could not understand. I crashed into the tree line and kept running. Branches whipped at my face. Snow fell from the boughs above, showering down cold and blinding. I did not look back. I just ran, terror driving me forward, the darkness of the forest swallowing me whole. I do not know how long I ran. Time lost meaning in that nightmare scramble through the trees. Eventually, I burst out onto the service road far from where I had parked. My truck was nowhere in sight. I was disoriented, lost, the failing light making everything look the same. I heard an engine. Headlights appeared through the trees. Coming down the road, a park ranger's truck. I stumbled into the road, waving my arms. The truck stopped, and a woman in uniform got out, her hand on her radio, her expression wary. I tried to explain, told her about the cabin, the lights, the people in the woods. She listened without interrupting, her face growing more concerned with every word. When I finished, she asked me to get in the truck. We drove back toward where I had been, but the turnoff to the cabin was gone. Just unbroken forest where the service road should have been. The ranger told me there were no occupied cabins in this area, that the power company records showed no active accounts for miles. She asked if I had been drinking, if I was on medication. I showed her the phone I had taken, but when we looked at it, the message was gone. The screen was locked, asking for a passcode I did not have. She drove me back to my truck, which we found parked along the highway, exactly where she said I must have left it before wandering into the woods. My toolkit was in the back, untouched. There was no work order in my records. No unusual power consumption. Nothing. I went home. I told my wife I got turned around in the woods and lost track of time. She believed me, or pretended to, but I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those figures circling the cabin. Heard those footsteps in perfect sync. 3 weeks later, I still do not know what I found out there. The phone is in my desk drawer, locked and useless. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear it vibrate. When I check, there is nothing. No notifications, no messages, but yesterday, something changed. I got a call from the power company. A real one this time, verified and official. They said there had been a report of unusual activity at a remote location near Coldfoot. They want me to go check it out. The address matches the coordinates I remember from before. I told them I would think about it, but I know I am going back. I have to, because whatever is in that cabin, whatever those people were, they knew I was coming. They left that message for me. They wanted me to find it. And the most terrifying part, I think they are still waiting. Lights on, heat running, coffee getting cold, waiting for me to come back and finish what I started. Some doors should never be opened. Some places should stay lost in the wilderness. But the human mind cannot let go of mysteries, cannot stop picking at wounds. And that is exactly what they are counting on. The darkness in Alaska is not just the absence of light. It is something older, something patient, something that knows how to bait a trap and wait for the curious to wander in. I leave tomorrow at dawn. I do not think I am coming back. But if you are listening to this, if you ever find yourself on a lonely road in the wilderness and you see a cabin with all its lights burning bright, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Do not stop. Do not look. And whatever you do, do not go inside. Because some invitations are not what they seem. And some horror is not meant to be understood. Only survive. Story 4. River that didn't defreeze right. I'm going to tell you something that most people want to believe. Something that happened to me in Alaska 3 years ago that changed everything about how I see the world. Something scary and horrifying that I kept buried, but I can't anymore. The weight of it is crushing me. So I'm going to tell you now, and maybe you'll understand why I can sleep without every light in my house burning. The nightmare started in late October when I drove my truck up the Dalton Highway, heading toward Fairbanks. I was a surveyor then, working for an oil company that didn't care much about the remote jobs nobody else wanted. The pay was good, and I was alone, which I liked. No complications, no one asking questions, just me, my maps, and the endless Alaskan wilderness stretching out in every direction like something alive and watching. The first sign that something was deeply unsettling about this particular job came from my handler at the office, a woman named Sandra who had been cold to me in every interaction we had. When I asked her about the coordinates for my survey work, she handed me the papers with trembling hands. Her fingers were shaking. I remember thinking that was strange. Sandra wasn't the type to shake. She was practical, efficient, and dead inside in the way office people often are. But when she looked at me over her glasses, I saw something in her eyes that made my skin crawl. Fear. Real, genuine fear. She told me to avoid the river. Just like that. No explanation. No context. Just avoid the river near Prospect Creek. When I asked her why, she wouldn't answer. She turned back to her computer and pretended I wasn't there anymore. I should have listened to that instinct. that creepy feeling whispering that something was deeply wrong. But I didn't. I drove north anyway. The landscape in that part of Alaska is the kind of terrain that makes you feel insignificant. Endless forest, mountains that look like teeth, and skies so big it almost breaks your mind trying to comprehend it. The kind of place where you understand how small you are, how alone you are, and how nobody would ever find your body if something happened. That realization hits different up there. It's not intellectual. It's visceral. It's terrifying. I set up camp near Prospect Creek 2 days later. The river was maybe a quarter mile from my site, cutting through a dense forest of spruce trees that barely let sunlight through even at midday. The October air was already cold enough to see your breath, and the sun was disappearing earlier each day. I could feel winter approaching like a living thing, an eerie presence creeping down from the Arctic, getting closer every night. On my first evening, I walked down to the river. I didn't know why I did it. Something was pulling me toward it, an unsettling curiosity that overrode my earlier conversations with Sandra and every sensible instinct I had. I should have stayed in my camp. I should have avoided it completely, but I didn't. And that was the moment everything became disturbing and wrong. The ice was forming, but it was wrong. Completely wrong. The surface had patterns in it that didn't make sense. In normal winters, river ice forms in predictable ways, spreading out from the edges, thickening gradually. But this ice had gaps. Deep, dark gaps that seemed to go down forever, surrounded by thick bands of white that looked almost crystalline. The gaps weren't random either. They followed a pattern, lines, almost like they were drawn deliberately. I stood there in the gathering darkness, staring at that eerie river, and I felt something shift in my chest. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The unsettling feeling intensified when I noticed something else. The locals. There was a small settlement about 2 miles downstream, and I'd seen people there the day before when I drove through. But nobody came to the river. I watched for an hour, and in that entire time, not a single person approached the water's edge. They walked everywhere else, moved between buildings, came and went, but they treated that river like it was radioactive, like it was haunted or worse. That night, I tried to sleep in my tent, but the nightmare wouldn't come. I lay there in the darkness, listening to sounds I couldn't identify. The creepy sounds of the forest at night. Branches cracking, animals moving through the underbrush. Things I told myself were normal, natural, nothing to fear. But the sounds had a rhythm to them. They seemed deliberately spaced out, as if whatever was making them was watching me, waiting, observing. My heart was hammering. My hands were shaking. I was terrified, and I didn't even know why. The next morning, I forced myself to focus on work. I had coordinates to map, measurements to take. I spent the day working a section of forest about a mile from the river, and I tried not to think about those gaps in the ice, those horrifying patterns that made no sense. But as the sun began to set again, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to walk back to the river. I told myself it was just to get another look, to rationalize what I'd seen, to convince myself that I misunderstood something simple. What I found was far worse than anything I could have imagined. The gaps in the ice had expanded, and now I could see something inside them. Something dark, something that looked almost like it was moving. The terrifying realization hit me that the gaps weren't just random formations. They were deliberate, they were shaped, and as I got closer, fighting against every screaming instinct telling me to run, I could make out what they were. Hands. The gaps were shaped like hands, reaching up from beneath the ice. I staggered backward, my boots slipping on the frozen ground. My mind was reeling. The chilling truth was obvious now, so horrifying that I could barely breathe. There were things under that ice, things that were still trying to claw their way out. The eerie patterns I noticed weren't the ice formations at all. They were the marks of something desperately trying to escape from below. I ran back to my camp. I don't remember the exact route I took, but I remember my lungs burning in the cold air, my legs pumping, and my breath coming in terrified gasps. The nightmare was becoming real. Whatever this was, whatever was happening in that river, it was beyond anything I understood. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get my laptop to work when I got back to the tent. I searched for anything about Prospect Creek, anything about the river, anything that would explain what I was seeing. It took me 2 hours of scrolling through obscure forums and local websites, but I finally found something. A post from 6 months earlier, buried deep on an Alaskan history website. It was written by a woman named Margaret Henley, who claimed to be a nurse in the settlement near Prospect Creek. She described exactly what I was seeing. The ice forming wrong, the patterns, the locals avoiding the river. And then she described something even more terrifying. According to Margaret's post, the people in that settlement had a story, a legend passed down through generations. In the 1920s, during the harshest winter on record, a group of miners had been caught in a blizzard near the river. They were trying to cross on the ice when the ground collapsed beneath them. Some fell through, some didn't. Those who fell through never came out. But the ice didn't freeze right after that. Every winter, the ice would form with those strange gaps, with those shapes. And Margaret had written that she believed the gaps were the miners, still trapped, still trying to get out. But here is what made it absolutely horrifying. Margaret's post ended abruptly, mid-sentence. And when I searched for more information about her, I found a news article from 6 months earlier. Margaret Henley had gone missing near the river. She walked out one night and never come back. The authorities had found her coat on the ice, but nothing else. Not a trace of the woman herself. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent with every lantern burning, every light I had creating a small bubble of safety around me. The darkness outside felt like a living thing, pressing against my tent, waiting for me to turn off the lights. The terrifying weight of knowing something that nobody wanted me to know was suffocating. I checked my phone repeatedly. I had barely any signal, but I kept trying to call Sandra, trying to reach the office, trying to tell someone what I discovered. On the third day, I made a decision. I was going to confront the locals. I was going to find someone willing to tell me the truth about what was happening in that river. What was happening beneath that ice. The decision was a mistake, but I was desperate, and desperation makes you do chilling things. I drove into the settlement in the late afternoon. The town was small, maybe 30 permanent residents, buildings that looked like they were held together by rust and fear. I pulled up to what looked like a general store and went inside. There was an old man behind the counter, probably in his 70s, with eyes that had seen too much. When he looked at me, I saw that same fear I'd seen in Sandra's face back at the office. But there was something else in his eyes too. Resignation. He already knew why I was there. His name was Tom. That was all he would tell me. He wouldn't say his last name. When I started asking about the river, about the patterns in the ice, about what was underneath, he just stared at me for a long moment. Then he told me something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. He told me to leave, to get in my truck and drive south immediately, to never come back to this area. He said that the river had been wrong since the 1920s, that every winter the ice formed that way, and that people who stayed to investigate never left. The eerie truth was that the settlement existed to keep people away from the river, not to help the miners, to contain them, but containing them was becoming harder. He said, every winter, the ice formed differently. Every year, the shapes looked more defined, more desperate, more intelligent. Last winter, for the first time, the ice had actually cracked. Cracked from below. The miners, or whatever they become after 90 years beneath that ice, were getting stronger. Getting closer to breaking through. Tom told me something else that made my blood freeze. He said the company that hired me knew about the river. They knew about what happened there. That is why they sent surveyors to that location. They weren't mapping for oil wells. They were monitoring the river, watching to see if the ice would hold, watching to see if whatever was underneath would break free. I left the settlement within 20 minutes. I packed my truck in complete silence, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind reeled with the horrifying implications of what Tom had told me. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. As I drove south on the Dalton Highway, the sun setting behind me, I made the terrifying decision to look in my rearview mirror one last time. The sky above Prospect Creek was glowing. A faint, sickly blue light was emanating from the area where the river was located. The unsettling luminescence was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't the northern lights. It was something else, something coming from below the ice. I drove through the night without stopping. I didn't care about fatigue or the dangerous roads. All I cared about was getting away from that place, from that river, from whatever was trapped beneath the ice and desperately trying to claw its way out into the world. The terrifying truth about what I witnessed was something I didn't want to confront, didn't want to accept, but couldn't deny. When I got back to the office in Anchorage, I walked straight into Sandra's office and demanded answers. The chilling look on her face told me everything I needed to know. She'd been expecting me to come back with questions. She'd been dreading this moment. She admitted, in a quiet voice that barely rose above a whisper, that the company knew. They'd always known. The settlement wasn't T-town. It was a research station. They were monitoring the ice, monitoring whatever was underneath. The 1920s miners had never actually died in an accident. That was a cover story. The real truth was darker, more horrifying. They'd been sent down into the ice deliberately, sealed in for an experiment. An experiment that went catastrophically wrong. Something had happened to them down there. Something that changed them. Something that made them wrong in ways that nobody fully understood. The company had been trying to manage the situation for nearly a century, but the creatures beneath the ice were getting stronger, getting more aware, getting closer to breaking through. Sandra told me I had 3 choices. I could forget everything and go back to work. I could leave the company and sign an NDA that would silence me permanently. Or I could disappear, just vanish, like Margaret Henley had disappeared. The scary implication was clear. They would make me vanish if I didn't agree to one of the first 2 options. I took the second option. I left Alaska that week. I moved to Texas, bought a house in a place where the winters are warm and there's no ice anywhere. I changed my job, changed my routine, tried to build a new life. But every winter, when the temperature drops and I see ice forming on puddles and ponds, I think about Prospect Creek. I think about those shapes beneath the ice. I think about what those things might be trying to accomplish. And 6 months ago, something changed. I got an email from an unknown sender. There was no text in the message, no subject line, just an attachment, a photograph. It was a news article from Alaska, dated 3 days ago. The headline read, "River ice breaks in worst winter storm in 50 years." The article described catastrophic flooding, a massive breach in the ice formation at Prospect Creek, and something else. Search and rescue teams had been called to the area after reports of people wandering in the forest near the settlement. People who hadn't been seen before. People whose origins couldn't be explained. The article included a photograph of one of the people they found. I almost vomited when I saw it. The figure was humanoid, but barely. The skin was translucent and seemed to glow with that same sickly blue light I'd seen emanating from the river. The eyes were wrong. They were too large, too dark, and they seemed to be looking directly at the camera. Directly at me. The article had been deleted from every online source within hours. They searched everywhere, and I can't find it anymore. But the email remains in my inbox. The photograph remains on my computer. And the terrifying truth is becoming increasingly clear. Whatever was beneath that ice is breaking free. Whatever those miners became is escaping. And the only person who knows the truth about what is coming. Last week, I received another email. This time there was a message. Just 5 words. 5 words that have destroyed any hope I had of moving on with my life. The message said, "We know where you are now. I am telling you this story because I need you to know the truth. The unsettling reality that there are places in Alaska, in America, in the world, where things exist that shouldn't exist. Where corporations keep secrets that cost people their lives. Where something dark and incomprehensible is trapped beneath the earth, scratching at the ice, trying desperately to escape into a world that isn't prepared for it. The chilling part is that I don't know if they coming for me. I don't know if they all come for you. I don't know how many of them escaped when that ice finally broke. But I know that somewhere in Alaska, in that settlement near Prospect Creek, there is a river that didn't freeze right. And there are things underneath it that should have stayed buried forever. Every night, I check my doors and windows. Every night, I leave every light burning. Every night, I listen to the sounds of the world outside my house and wonder if one of them is coming. If one of the things from beneath the ice is walking across America, trying to find me, trying to find everyone who knows the truth. The nightmare hasn't ended. It is only just beginning. And I think, after 90 years, they were finally hungry enough to come up into the world. Story 5. Radio that stayed silent. What if I told you that something out there in Alaska doesn't want to be found? That there are places so remote, so utterly disconnected from civilization, that the rules we know no longer apply? I am about to tell you about the scariest experience of my life. And I need you to understand something before I start. I am still not sure if what happened to me was real. My name is David, and I was 38 years old when I made the decision that changed everything. I had spent 17 years in the construction business in Seattle, and somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten what silence felt like. My mind was constantly running, calculations, schedules, problems that needed solving. My doctor told me I needed to get away, to really get away. Not a resort, not a hotel with room service. He meant gone. So I booked a small cabin in remote Alaska, near Denali, 500 miles from Anchorage. The cabin was listed on some outdoors website, completely off the grid. No internet, no cell service, a gas generator for electricity, a basic radio that supposedly worked if atmospheric conditions cooperated. That radio would become the most terrifying object in my life. I arrived on a Tuesday in late September. The forest around the cabin was magnificent and suffocating at the same time. Trees stretched in every direction, so thick and dense that the sky seemed to disappear. The cabin itself was small, maybe 800 square feet, with large windows facing the woods. I remember thinking how exposed it felt, despite being surrounded by wilderness. Like something could be watching from just beyond the tree line at any moment. The first 3 days were exactly what I needed. Quiet, real quiet, the kind where you stop hearing your own thoughts after a while. I read books, I walked the nearby trails. I sat on the porch and listened to nothing but wind and the occasional bird. By day 3, I was starting to feel human again. My shoulders had dropped from my ears for the first time in years. My jaw wasn't clenched. That's when the radio incident happened. I was inside the cabin in the early evening, around 6 o'clock, when I decided to turn on the emergency radio. The owner had mentioned I should check it periodically, make sure the batteries were good, test the frequency that connected to the ranger station. Standard safety stuff. I flipped the power switch and waited for the usual static, that white noise hum that radio equipment makes. Nothing. No static. No signal. Just dead air stretching too long. I adjusted the frequency dial. Still nothing. Just silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence I'd been enjoying. This silence felt different. It felt hollow. I checked the batteries. They were fine. I adjusted every knob on that old radio. Cycled through every frequency listed on the instruction card. Dead air on every single one. That should have worried me, but I was still in that relaxed frame of mind. I told myself the weather would clear, the atmosphere would cooperate eventually, and the radio would work fine. The cabin had supplies. I wasn't in any danger. I was scheduled to stay for 2 more weeks anyway. I turned the radio off and didn't think much about it. By day 5, I noticed something else was wrong. I'd been taking a walk every afternoon along the main trail about 2 miles from the cabin. It was a routine 3-mile loop that took about 90 minutes. The trail was well marked, and I memorized the landmarks. On day 5, I took that walk like I always did. But when I reached the midpoint where a large fallen spruce tree crossed the path, something felt off. The tree had been oriented north to south. Now it was running east to west. I stood there staring at it for 5 minutes, my heart starting to pick up speed. I was certain about this. I photographed the tree because it was so massive. I even still had the photo on my camera. But looking at that photo now, with the tree in front of me running the opposite direction, my mind couldn't process the contradiction. Maybe I misremembered. Maybe I somehow taken the picture from a different angle than I thought. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I cut the walk short that day. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the doors. The sun didn't set until almost 8 that time of year, but suddenly the forest felt full of things I couldn't see. Things that wanted to remain hidden. The next morning, I tried the radio again. Dead air. No static. No signal. Nothing but silence that seemed to have weight to it, pressing against my ears like the dead silence you hear in a very deep place underground. I tested it 6 times that day, at different hours, hoping for atmospheric changes. Each time, the same thing. Nothing. Complete silence. That is when the first real spike of fear hit me. Not the creeping unease, but actual fear. I should have left then. I should have packed my things and driven back to Anchorage. But there's something about fear that makes you want to understand what is causing it. Irrational, I know. But I needed to figure out what was happening. Was the radio broken? Had something happened to the ranger station? Was there a weather phenomenon blocking all signals? I started keeping a journal. I didn't know why exactly. Maybe so I have a record of what was happening. Maybe so I could prove to myself later that I wasn't imagining things. The entries grew more erratic. Day 7. The sun has set. It's been dark for 3 hours now. They turned off all the lights inside the cabin, and I am sitting by the window with a flashlight, watching the forest. I saw movement about an hour ago, about 50 yards from the cabin. Something large. It moved with a strange, elongated gait. Too long for a moose, too deliberate to be a bear. I watched for 20 minutes but didn't see it again. Probably a moose after all. Stress making me imagine things. Day 8. I heard scratching sounds on the exterior wall at approximately 2 in the morning. Sharp, deliberate scratching, like something with claws trying to get through wood. I have no rifle, no real weapons except a kitchen knife. I stood in the center of the cabin with every light on, listening to that sound move slowly along the wall. It lasted 7 minutes, then it stopped. In the morning, I examined the wall from the outside. Nothing, no marks, no indication anything was there. Day 9. Something is wrong with the forest. I took my afternoon walk and all the landmark trees have moved. This is not paranoia. This is not stress. The trail configuration has changed. Trees that should be on the left are on the right. The fallen spruce tree is in a different location entirely now. I was walking in circles for an hour before I realized I wasn't on the same trail anymore. The forest had somehow rearranged itself. The radio remained silent. I have tried every frequency 16 times today. Day 10. I cannot explain what I experienced today. I was inside the cabin, and I heard a sound. It was coming from the roof. Something walking. Heavy footsteps, but not quite right. The gait was uneven, 1 foot heavier than the other. And the steps were too far apart to be human. It walked from one end of the cabin roof to the other, approximately 40 feet, then stopped. I waited, trembling, for it to move. Nothing for 7 hours. Then it walked back, the same uneven gait, the same spacing, as if it had been programmed to do that exact walk. Then it stopped at what I estimate to be directly above my bed. I did not sleep that night. The footsteps resumed at 3 in the morning and continued until dawn. Day 11. Something changed. The sun is different. It is setting in the wrong direction. I am certain of it. The sun sets in the west. For the past 11 days, the sun has been setting in the northwest from the cabin. Today it set in the south. The shadows are wrong. The light is wrong. I am not losing my mind. I need to believe that I am not losing my mind. I didn't write anything on day 12. That was the day I realized what was actually happening, and that realization was more terrifying than any footsteps on the roof. I had gone outside in the morning, desperate to find any sign of human presence. I walked further from the cabin than I'd ever gone before, pushing through the dense forest, looking for power lines or roads or anything. The forest just continued, trees and darkness and that pressing silence. And then I found something. A cabin. It was about 200 yards from my cabin, nearly invisible because it had been overgrown by moss and nature. But it was clearly a structure, and when I looked closer, I felt my entire body go cold. It was my cabin, or rather, it was identical to my cabin. Same style, same dimensions, same window placement. I approached it slowly, my fear rising with every step. When I looked through the window, I saw myself sitting at the table, head down, motionless. For several seconds I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I was seeing. Then the figure looked up. The face was right, but something was desperately wrong with the eyes. They were too large. They reflected light like an animal's eyes. I ran. I didn't stop running until I reached my cabin and locked the door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the lock. That's when I finally understood that something had changed since I arrived here. The forest wasn't just isolating me. The forest was replacing things. It was copying things. It was creating versions of things that belonged to it now. And the radio wasn't too broken. The radio was staying silent because nothing out here wants to be reached. Nothing wants to be found. And whatever was walking on my roof, whatever was in that other cabin wearing my face, had come with the intention that I would understand something very specific. I was no longer in a place that civilization could reach. The radio would stay silent forever because I was no longer in Alaska. I was somewhere else entirely, somewhere the rules didn't apply, somewhere the forest had already claimed, and was actively choosing to hold me in, slowly, deliberately, while it learned how to be human more convincingly. The scratching sounds I heard on day 8, they were never trying to get in, they were trying to get out, from inside the walls, from inside the place that was learning to be a cabin. From inside the thing that was learning to be me. On the morning of day 13, I tried the radio again. This time, it came alive. Just for a moment. Just long enough for me to hear what sounded like dozens of voices, all speaking at once, all saying the same thing, all in variations of my own voice, repeating a single phrase over and over, getting closer and more panicked with each repetition. Help me, help me, help me, help me, help me. Then silence again. The radio hasn't made another sound since. I am writing this now with the knowledge that I don't have much time left. Whatever process started the day I arrived here is accelerating. I can see differences in my hands. The fingers are slightly too long. My reflection in the mirror seems to be moving on its own schedule now, doing things a few seconds after I do them. The forest outside has stopped being a forest. It is becoming something else. Something that breathes. Something that thinks. The other cabin is getting closer. Every morning I see it a little nearer to mine. And every morning, the thing that was wearing my face grows just a little bit better at looking like me. It's studying me through the gap between our homes. If you, rehearing this, if this story has somehow made it out of this place, understand what I am warning you. There are parts of the world that don't belong to humanity anymore. There are places where the old rules have been broken and replaced with something we can understand. Alaska is bigger than anyone realizes. Most of it has never been mapped. Most of it belongs to something else now. And somewhere in those uncharted millions of acres, something is learning to wear a human face. Something that walks on roofs with an uneven gait. Something that copies and learns and gets better at the mimicry every single day. The radio will stay silent. That's how you know you're in the wrong place. That's how you know you've already been replaced. Story 6. Last stop before nowhere. I found a gas station in Alaska that should not exist, and what I discovered there still wakes me up screaming in the middle of the night. Let me be clear about something right from the start. I have driven through every corner of this country, 42 states, 15 years behind the wheel of a long-haul truck. I have seen things on those empty highways that would make your skin crawl, but nothing, absolutely nothing, compares to what happened on that frozen stretch of road 300 miles north of Anchorage. It was February, deep into the Alaskan winter, when darkness swallows the world for 20 hours a day and the cold becomes something alive, something that hunts. I was hauling supplies to a mining operation near Dead Horse, running behind schedule because of a storm that had turned the highway into a death trap. The company dispatcher kept calling, kept pushing, kept reminding me that every hour of delay cost them money. So I pushed through when I should have stopped. I kept driving when every instinct in my body screamed at me to find shelter and wait for dawn. The snow fell in thick curtains that turned my headlights useless. The road disappeared beneath fresh powder every few seconds. My fuel gauge hovered just above empty, that terrifying red zone that makes your heart beat faster with each passing mile. And then, like something out of a fever dream, I saw lights cutting through the darkness ahead. A gas station materialized from the blizzard, glowing like a beacon in that endless white nightmare. The sign read, Frontier Fuel, in letters that flickered and buzzed, half the bulbs dead or dying. Relief flooded through me as I guided my rig toward the pumps, already imagining hot coffee and maybe a chance to call the dispatcher. Tell him I was taking a break whether he liked it or not. That relief lasted exactly as long as it took me to step out of my truck. The cold hit me like a physical blow, but that was normal for Alaska in February. What was not normal, what made my breath catch in my throat and sent the first spike of fear through my chest, was the snow around the station. Fresh snow, perfect, untouched snow. No footprints, no tire marks, nothing to indicate that any living thing had been here for hours, maybe days. The snow had stopped falling maybe 20 minutes before I arrived, and the layer covering everything looked at least 6 inches deep. But the lights were on, the pumps were running, their digital displays glowing green in the darkness. And when I walked to the front door of the small station building, I found it unlocked. The door swung open with a sound that echoed too loudly in the silence. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed and flickered overhead, casting everything in that sickly yellow glow that makes the world look diseased. The air felt wrong, too warm and too still, like the inside of a tomb that had been sealed for decades. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with the usual truck stop supplies. Chips, beef jerky, energy drinks, motor oil. Everything covered in a thin layer of dust that suggested nobody had touched anything in a very long time. Behind the counter, a coffee maker burbled and hissed, a fresh pot brewing. The smell filled the small space, rich and inviting and absolutely horrifying because it meant someone had been here recently. Someone had started that coffee. But the snow outside told a different story, a story that made no sense unless you accepted something impossible and terrifying. I called out, my voice sounding strange and hollow in that empty space. Nobody answered. The building consisted of just this one room. Nowhere for anyone to hide. No back office or storage area visible. Just shelves, a counter, a coffee maker, and that oppressive silence that felt like it was watching me. My hands shook as I poured coffee into a foam cup, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the owner lived upstairs. Maybe there was a door I had missed. Maybe the snow had only just stopped and the wind had covered their tracks. But I knew these explanations were lies even as I thought them. I had been driving through that storm for hours. The snow had fallen steadily until exactly 23 minutes ago, and then stopped completely. I had checked my dashboard clock, and the layer covering everything outside was far too thick to have accumulated in such a short time. The coffee tasted normal, which somehow made everything worse. I stood there in that fluorescent nightmare, drinking coffee that someone or something had prepared, and tried to decide what to do next. My truck needed fuel. I needed to call the dispatcher. And some dark, curious part of my mind needed to understand what was happening here, needed to solve this disturbing mystery before I could leave. That curiosity almost killed me. I noticed the logbook first, sitting open on the counter next to an old-fashioned cash register. The kind of logbook that small, independent stations keep to track deliveries and maintenance. I flipped through the pages, and my hands started shaking so badly I almost dropped my coffee. The last entry was dated 3 years ago, December 15th, 3 years before that night. The handwriting was shaky, hurried, desperate. It read, "Something is wrong with the snow. It falls but nothing touches it. The customers keep coming but they do not leave footprints. I think I am the only real thing left here." Below that, in the same handwriting but even more frantic, I tried to leave. The road goes nowhere. I drive for hours and end up back here. Always back here. The station will not let me go. And finally, the last line, written in letters so hard the pen had torn through the paper. "If you are reading this, run. Do not stay. Do not try to understand. The darkness here is hungry and is always watching." I dropped the logbook like it had burned me. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to get back in my truck and drive. Forget the fuel. Forget the delivery. Just get away from this cursed place. But before I could move, I heard it. A sound from outside. Not footsteps, because footsteps would make sense. This was something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. It sounded like breathing. Deep, slow, rhythmic breathing, like something massive was inhaling and exhaling just outside the walls. And with each breath, the lights dimmed slightly, as if whatever was out there was feeding on the electricity, draining the life from this place one breath at a time. I ran to the window and immediately wished I had not. The snow outside was moving. Not falling, not drifting in the wind. Moving, crawling across the ground like a living thing, forming patterns and shapes that hurt to look at directly. And in those patterns, I started to see faces. Dozens of faces pressed against the white surface, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with terror and hopelessness. They were the faces of travelers. People like me who had stopped here when they should have kept driving. People who had been trapped by whatever dark thing lived in this place, absorbed into the snow itself, their consciousness preserved in that frozen hell for eternity. And I realized with sick certainty that the owner was one of them now. The person who wrote that desperate warning in the logbook had become part of the snow, part of the darkness, part of this nightmare that pretended to be a gas station. The breathing grew louder, the lights dimmed further, and I understood that I had maybe minutes before the same thing happened to me, before I became just another face in the snow. Another warning that nobody would heed. I grabbed my keys and ran for the door, but it would not open. The handle turned, but the door stayed shut, as if something on the other side was holding it closed. Through the window, I could see my truck. Still there, still real, but impossibly far away. The distance between the door and my rig seemed to stretch and grow, expanding into miles of haunted space that I would never be able to cross. That is when I remembered something my grandfather told me when I was a child. Back when he was still alive and still told stories about his time in the Alaskan wilderness. He said there were places in the far north where reality wore thin, where the border between our world and something older and darker became permeable. He said if you ever found yourself in such a place, the only way to escape was to deny its existence completely, to reject it with every fiber of your being and refuse to acknowledge its power over you. I thought he was telling ghost stories to scare a kid. I never imagined I would need that advice to save my life. I closed my eyes and focused on everything I knew to be real and true. The weight of my body, the smell of coffee, the sound of my own heartbeat, the cold air in my lungs. I thought about my daughter waiting for me back in Seattle, about the dispatcher who would be calling soon, about the mining crew expecting their supplies. I thought about every mile of highway I had ever driven, every sunrise I had seen from behind the wheel, every small piece of my ordinary, rational life. And I spoke out loud, my voice steady despite the fear. You are not real. This place is not real. I do not believe in you. I deny you. I refuse you. The breathing stopped. For one eternal moment, everything went completely silent. And then the door flew open, torn from its hinges by some invisible force. And I ran. I do not remember crossing the distance to my truck. 1 second I was inside the station. The next I was behind the wheel, key in the ignition, engine roaring to life. The fuel gauge still read near empty, but I did not care. I slammed the accelerator down and the truck lurched forward, tires spinning on the ice, headlights cutting through snow that was now falling again, normal snow, regular snow, snow that fell down instead of crawling across the ground. In my rearview mirror, I watched the gas station recede into the darkness. And just before it disappeared completely, I saw something that will haunt me until the day I die. A figure standing in the doorway, illuminated by those flickering lights. Too tall to be human, too thin, arms that hung down past its knees and a head that tilted at an angle that should have been impossible. It raised one of those two long arms and waved at me. A slow, deliberate gesture that was somehow worse than any monster or scream could have been. A wave that said, I will see you again. Eventually, they all come back. I drove for 6 hours on fumes and prayer before I found a real gas station, one with fresh tire tracks and footprints and a bored attendant who looked at me like I was crazy when I tried to explain why I was shaking. I called the dispatcher and told him I was taking a week off, that he could fire me if he wanted, but I was not getting back in that truck for a while. Later, when I was safe and warm in a hotel room in Fairbanks, I tried to find the station on maps and GPS. Nothing. No record of a Frontier fuel anywhere on that stretch of highway. I called the Alaska Department of Transportation. They told me there were no gas stations for 200 miles in either direction of where I had been. They suggested I had been disoriented by the storm, that stress and exhaustion had made me confused. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and I know that somewhere in the Alaskan wilderness, there is a place that should not exist, a trap disguised as salvation, waiting for the next desperate traveler to see its lights and feel that fatal moment of relief. I still drive trucks, but I avoid Alaska now. I avoid anywhere that gets too dark, too empty, too far from civilization. Because I understand something now that most people never learn. There are hungry things in the spaces between, in the forgotten corners where human presence grows thin and reality becomes negotiable. And those things have learned to disguise themselves as exactly what we need most when we are vulnerable and afraid. Sometimes late at night, when I am alone on an empty highway, I still see lights in the distance that look too inviting, too perfectly placed. And I always drive past them, no matter how empty my tank gets, no matter how tired I am. Because I know now that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. Some places, once visited, never fully let you leave. And somewhere in that endless Alaskan night, a gas station that does not exist is still waiting, still glowing, still preparing fresh coffee for the next person who makes the mistake of stopping. The next person who will see that perfect, untouched snow and think, just for a moment, that maybe there is a logical explanation. There is not. There never is. And by the time you realize that, it is already far too late. Story 7. Road that felt watched. I was being followed, but nothing was there. That is where this story starts. Not with a crash or a scream or a monster jumping out from the darkness. Just the terrifying, creepy feeling that something was watching me from the empty Alaskan highway at 2 in the morning. That sensation you get when you know someone is looking at the back of your head, except there was nothing. No headlights behind me, no car, no sound, just the eerie knowledge that I was not alone. My name is David, and I'm 42 years old. I drive trucks for a living, or I did, before the thing that happened on the Richardson Highway changed everything. This is the true story of what occurred, and I am telling it now because I need someone to know. I need someone to understand that some places in Alaska aren't haunted by ghosts. They re-haunted by something that hasn't earned a name yet. Something that watches. The drive from Anchorage to Fairbanks is normally about 7 hours. I've done it dozens of times before. 14 hours of driving per week, back and forth, hauling supplies and materials. The road is lonely, sure, but it is routine. It is safe, or it was, until that particular September night when I decided to push through without stopping. I should have stopped at a motel in Glen Ellen. The thought came to me just as I passed the marker indicating I was 200 miles from my destination. My eyes were tired. My shoulders ached. The smart move would have been to pull into one of the small towns along the route and get some sleep. But I was making good time. The roads were clear, and something in my gut was telling me to keep moving north. Not a good feeling, a pushing feeling, an urgent feeling that I needed to get wherever I was going. So I drove on, and that is when the sensation started. It wasn't sudden. It built gradually, so slowly that I almost didn't notice it at first. A subtle weight in the air, a pressure that seemed to come from the empty forest on both sides of the highway. The darkness out there was the kind of darkness you only find in interior Alaska, far from any city lights, where the night presses down on you like a physical thing. But this darkness felt different. This darkness felt aware. My dashboard clock read 1:47 a.m. I was passing through a stretch of road I recognized, a section where the trees pulled back slightly from the pavement, creating a small valley about a mile across. Normally, I would use this stretch to speed up a bit, to break the monotony of the endless tree line. But tonight, something made me slow down. My foot eased off the accelerator without me consciously deciding to do it. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. The feeling was getting stronger. It started as a tickle at the base of my skull, that primal instinct that tells mammals when a predator is near. Except there was nothing to predicate on. The road ahead was empty. The mirrors showed only my own headlights reflecting off the asphalt behind me. The radio was playing quietly, some country station out of Fairbanks that kept cutting in and out, and I turned it off. The silence that followed felt even more unsettling than the music had been. Nothing moved. Still, the feeling stayed. This is what terrified me more than anything else. If I had seen something, heard something, encountered actual danger, I could have reacted. I could have sped up or pulled off the road or called for help. But this was different. This was the eerie sensation of being watched by something that existed in the space between reality and paranoia. The kind of fear that makes you question your own mind. I checked the mirror again. Still nothing. The highway curved slightly to the right, and I followed the bend. My truck felt suddenly too small, too fragile. The metal exterior that had always felt like protection now felt like a cage. Whatever was watching me was out there, in the darkness, in the forest, in the spaces between the trees. It was enormous and patient and absolutely certain about what it wanted. My hands were shaking. I'd driven through bear country hundreds of times. I had a moose step into the road once, forcing me to slam on the brakes. I weathered whiteout conditions where I could barely see the hood of my truck. But I never felt anything like this. This wasn't the fear of an animal encounter. This was something darker, more fundamental. This was the scary, chilling sensation that the natural world had decided I didn't belong here anymore. The clock read 2:04 a.m. 17 minutes had passed since I first noticed the sensation. Or had it been longer? Time felt distorted out here. The highway stretched ahead in an endless ribbon of asphalt, and I realized I hadn't passed a single other vehicle in the entire 17 minutes. On the Richardson Highway, even at 2 in the morning, you usually saw at least one truck heading in the opposite direction. But tonight, I was absolutely alone. The thought that came to me next was terrifying in its simplicity. What if the road itself was watching me? I know how that sounds. I am a rational man. I work with logistics and schedules and mechanical problems. I don't believe in supernatural horror or paranormal activity. But out there, in that absolute darkness, with that horrible, creepy sensation pressing down on my spine, rational thoughts started to feel like a luxury I couldn't afford. I noticed the reflectors on the highway markers were glinting strangely. They should have reflected my headlights in a normal, predictable way. Instead, they seemed to be catching light from angles where there was no light source. The eerie glow shifted and moved, almost like they were watching my progress, tracking my position as I drove forward. My foot pressed the accelerator. The truck sped up. Not drastically, but enough that I could feel the engine responding. The sensation didn't decrease. If anything, it intensified. It was like the faster I drove, the more aware the darkness became of my presence. The more urgent and hungry the feeling of being watched grew. Then I saw the first sign. It was nailed to a tree about 50 yards off the right side of the road, positioned in such a way that my headlights caught it perfectly. The wood was weathered gray, and someone had painted a message on it in faded white letters. All it said was, "Slow down." My blood went cold. I'd driven this stretch of highway at least 100 times, and I'd never seen that sign before. I was certain of it, the kind of certainty that comes from noticing the smallest details in a landscape you've traveled repeatedly. And now this sign was here, with its simple 2-word message, and I couldn't explain its presence. It didn't matter. I wasn't slowing down. Whatever was watching me, whatever was out there in that terrifying darkness, I had no intention of making myself a slower target. I pressed the accelerator harder. The speedometer climbed. 60 miles per hour, 70. The road was straight and clear, and my truck was eating up the asphalt with increasing desperation. The forest on both sides had become nothing but a black blur. My headlights carved a tunnel through the night, and within that tunnel, the road seemed to extend infinitely, never getting shorter, never bringing me closer to safety. That is when I saw the second sign. This one was on the left side of the road, nailed to another tree, and it said, "We see you." I nearly swerved off the road. My hands jerked the steering wheel, and the truck lurched toward the shoulder before I regained control. The tires made a screeching sound that echoed off the surrounding forest, a noise that seemed far too loud in the oppressive silence of the night. My heart was pounding in my chest like a second engine, and my breathing had become rapid and shallow. The fear had escalated from unsettling to pure, concentrated horror. Someone was out there. Someone was actually in the forest, watching me, placing signs. Unless I was hallucinating, unless the exhaustion and the darkness and the eerie, creepy sensation had broken something in my mind. I forced myself to think logically. The signs could have been there for months. I might have simply missed them in previous trips. People lived in Alaska. People hunted and trapped in the forests along the highway. They could have posted warning signs for any number of reasons. Hunting season, road conditions, private property, except the message didn't match that explanation. "We see you" wasn't about hunting or property. It was personal. It was a threat. The clock read 2:19 a.m. I had maybe 40 miles to the next town. 40 miles. And then I'd be around other people. Then I'd be safe. I pushed the truck faster. 80 miles per hour. 85. The engine was screaming now, and I could feel the vehicle starting to become unstable at this speed on the narrow highway. The third sign appeared without warning. It was on the right side again, nailed to a tree just at the edge of my headlight beam. This time it said, "Stop the truck." I didn't stop. I couldn't. Stopping meant pulling over into the darkness, meant turning off the engine and sitting in silence while whatever was out there closed in. The thought of being stationary, of being an easy target, filled me with a dread so profound that I felt physically ill. My eyes were darting constantly now, scanning the forest on both sides of the road, looking for movement, looking for evidence of what was watching. But there was nothing, just trees and shadows and the horrible, eerie sensation that countless eyes were trained on my vehicle as it flew down the highway. The clock read 2:26 a.m., 39 minutes since the sensation had started, 39 minutes of pure fear, and the terrifying knowledge that something was directing my journey. The signs weren't too random. They were being placed in sequence. Someone was ahead of me on the road, placing signs, herding me like an animal. I came around a curve and nearly hit the fourth sign head on. It was in the middle of the road, attached to some kind of barricade or stand, and the headlights caught it fully. The message was short. "Look." Before I could process what I was reading, I noticed something in the darkness beyond the sign. A clearing, about 100 yards off the road, barely visible in the blackness. There was a small structure, a cabin or shed of some kind, and there was a light on inside. The light was the most terrifying thing I'd seen all night. Not because it was bright or threatening, but because it represented choice. It represented the idea that I could stop, that I could seek shelter, that I could find help or answers. It represented the nightmare of actually encountering whatever was doing this. I kept driving. The highway curved away from the clearing, and the light disappeared from my mirrors. I was breathing in short, desperate gasps now, and my hands were slick with sweat despite the cold night. Every instinct in my body was telling me that I just passed a point of no return, that I missed some crucial opportunity, that the thing watching me was now angry. The sensation changed. It shifted from a passive feeling of being observed to something active and purposeful. It was like the watcher had stopped being patient. The darkness seemed to press in from both sides of the highway, and the forest began to feel less like a natural landscape and more like a predator with teeth and claws. Another sign, then another, and another. They started appearing in rapid succession. Turn around. Go back. We're running out of time. Each one was more frantic than the last, as if the person placing them was becoming increasingly desperate to communicate with me. The clock read 2:33 a.m. I was maybe 30 miles from Fairbanks. 30 miles and I'd be in a town with people and lights and civilization. 30 miles and this nightmare would end. I was certain of it. I was absolutely, desperately certain that once I reached populated areas, once I was around other human beings, the feeling would stop. But something told me I was wrong. The highway began to straighten out, and I realized why. I was climbing, gaining elevation. The trees were becoming sparser, and the landscape was opening up. Normally, this would have felt like progress, like I was approaching the Fairbanks Valley. But tonight, it felt like I was running towards something just as dangerous as what I was running from. The last sign was the worst. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, and it took up most of the width of the road. I had to slow down to navigate around it. The message was written in large, crude letters that had clearly been painted recently. It's been following you since Anchorage. My entire body went numb. That message wasn't about the present moment. That message was about everything. It meant that the watcher hadn't picked me up somewhere along the highway. It meant I'd been observed the entire time. It meant that whatever this thing was, it had been there when I loaded my cargo in Anchorage. It had been there when I left the warehouse. It had been following me for more than 7 hours. I suddenly understood the urgent feeling I had, the strange compulsion that made me skip the motel in Glen Ellen and push north. That hadn't been my own instinct. That had been something else, something that wanted me to keep driving, to stay on the road, to follow a specific route that led toward the terrifying destination. The clock read 2:47 a.m. Fairbanks was only 20 miles away now. I could see the faint glow of the city on the horizon, the light pollution reflecting off the low clouds. Safety was close, but I could feel the watcher, this frustration now, the eerie sense that it was losing its opportunity. Whatever it wanted from me, whatever reason it had for following, for placing the signs, for hurting me like this, it was running out of time. I drove faster. The highway descended slightly, and the forest started to close in again. The last stretch before Fairbanks was always the darkest, the loneliest section. I only had to make it through maybe 5 more miles of that darkness, and then I'd be out. But the road changed. The asphalt beneath my wheels suddenly felt different, rougher, older. I realized I'd been so focused on the horizon that I hadn't noticed when I passed from the main highway onto a secondary road. I pulled at the steering wheel, trying to correct, but the truck wouldn't respond. It was like someone had taken control, like the vehicle itself was making decisions about where to go. This was no longer about the dark or the forest or the eerie sensation of being watched. This was about losing control. This was about the terrifying realization that I had been driving deeper and deeper into a trap, that every decision I made had been exactly what the watcher wanted me to make. The clock read 2:51 a.m. 4 minutes later, the road ended at a gate. I slammed on the brakes, and the truck skidded to a stop just inches from the metal barrier. Beyond the gate was darkness so complete that it seemed to have substance. Not forest, not sky, just an absolute void. And somewhere in that void, I could feel the watcher waiting. Patient again now, no longer chasing, now simply waiting for me to realize that I'd trapped myself. I sat in that truck for a long time, my hands frozen on the steering wheel, my breath fogging the windshield. I was hyperventilating, and my eyes were fixed on the gate in front of me. That's when I heard the sound. It came from behind the truck, from the direction I'd come. A footstep, slow, deliberate, and then another, and another. Someone was walking up the road toward me, coming out of the darkness. The footsteps were unhurried, almost casual, like the walker had all the time in the world. I should have turned the key in the ignition. I should have thrown the truck into reverse and plowed back the way I'd come. But I was frozen, paralyzed by the terrifying knowledge that whatever was behind me was no longer satisfied with simply watching. Now I was going to get close. Now it was going to show itself. The footsteps stopped. It was standing right outside my window. I could feel it there, just beyond the glass. The sensation of being watched had reached its peak, an intensity that made my skin feel like it was burning. My eyes were locked on the windshield, but I couldn't make myself turn to look. I sat there for what might have been seconds or might have been hours. Time had become meaningless. Then I heard something I hadn't expected. A sound, a voice, not through the window, but inside my own head. It said only one thing. You, home now? When I finally looked, nothing was there. The road behind me was empty. The darkness had receded. My headlights were showing me a completely normal stretch of highway, with trees and shadows and all the familiar elements of rural Alaska. But the gate in front of me was still there, still closed, still blocking the road ahead. And when I turned around to look back at the road I'd come down, I realized something that still wakes me up at night with my heart pounding. The signs I'd seen, the warning messages about being watched, about stopping, about turning around, they had all vanished. Every single one. It was like they never existed. But I remembered them. I could recall every word, every location. They had been real. I managed to reverse away from the gate. The truck responded this time. I drove back toward the main highway, moving slowly, carefully, looking for any sign that I'd passed. But there was nothing, no evidence, no proof that any of it had happened. When I finally reached Fairbanks at 3:47 a.m., the city was exactly as I left it dozens of times before. Normal, indifferent, full of people going about their lives with no knowledge of what existed in the darkness of the Richardson Highway. I never took that road again. I switched to the Seward Highway, adding 8 hours to every trip, just to avoid that stretch of road. My company questioned it, but I refused to explain. I couldn't explain. What would I say? That the road itself was haunted? That something was watching from the forest? That my truck had been steered against my will? But here, it's the thing that really gets me, the terrifying detail that keeps me up at night. 3 months after that experience, I got a phone call. It was a woman I'd never met, but she said she knew what had happened to me on the Richardson Highway. She said she had the same experience 3 years ago. She said there were others, maybe dozens, maybe hundreds, who driven that stretch of road and felt the sensation of being watched. She said the thing that follows us never leaves. She said I should stop trying to avoid the road. She said it was already in my truck, already part of my route, already woven into every journey I make. She said the only thing I can do is keep driving north, because it won, to be satisfied until I finally make it to whatever was waiting at the end. Then she hung up. I never heard from her again. I don't know if she was real. I don't know if that phone call actually happened, or if my mind is breaking down the way I always feared it would out there on those long, empty highways. What I do know is that every time I drive, I feel it again. That eerie, creepy sensation of being watched. And I know that one of these days, I want to slow down. One of these days, I want to turn around. One of these days, I'll follow the road exactly where it wants me to go. And I'm not sure whether I'm terrified of that moment or desperately waiting for it. Story 8. A house that wasn't abandoned. I bought a house in Alaska for $8,000. And I should have known something was terribly wrong when the realtor refused to step inside. The furniture was intact. The pantry was stocked with food. There were no signs of departure. Just an eerie silence that made my skin crawl the moment I crossed the threshold. My name is David, and 6 months ago I was living in Sacramento, drowning in debt after my divorce. When I saw the listing online, a 3-bedroom house in Fairbanks for less than the price of a used car, I thought it was a miracle. A chance to start over in a place where nobody knew my failures. The photos showed a normal home, maybe a little dated, but solid. The kind of place you could disappear into and rebuild your life. I should have asked why I was so cheap. I should have demanded answers. But desperation makes you stupid, and I was desperate in ways I did not want to admit. The realtor met me at the property on a gray October afternoon. She was a nervous woman in her 50s who kept her distance from the front door and spoke in clipped, professional sentences. She handed me the keys, pointed out the property lines, and told me the paperwork would be finalized by the end of the week. When I asked if she wanted to show me the interior, she looked at the house like it might bite her and said she had another appointment. Then she got in her car and left me standing there in the cold with a ring of keys and a creeping sense of unease. The house sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by birch trees that had gone skeletal for winter. It was a simple structure, wood siding painted a faded blue, a peaked roof, windows that reflected the overcast sky like dead eyes. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney. Lights should have been on, but the place looked hollow despite being fully furnished, and that rawness settled over me like a weight. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The hinges did not creak. The door swung smoothly, as if it had been used recently. Warm air drifted out, carrying the smell of dust and something else. Something organic and faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in a vase. The living room was frozen in time. A couch and 2 armchairs arranged around a coffee table. Magazines from 2019 stacked neatly beside a remote control. A television against the far wall, unplugged but clean. No dust on the screen. The carpet showed vacuum lines, perfectly straight, as if someone had cleaned just days ago. But the realtor had told me the house had been empty for 3 years. I moved through the room slowly, my footsteps muffled by the carpet, my breath visible in the cooling air. The kitchen was immaculate, dishes in the cupboards, glasses lined up by size, a coffee maker on the counter with a filter still in the basket. I opened the refrigerator and cold air rushed out. It was running, powered on. Inside, I found milk dated 2 weeks ago, eggs, butter, a covered dish of something that might have been leftovers. The sell-by dates were recent. Impossible. Fear began to pulse in my chest, a sick rhythm that made my hands shake. I checked the breaker box in the hallway. Everything was on. The heat was set to 68 degrees. Utilities that should have been shut off years ago were running as if someone still lived here, still paid the bills, still came home every night and turned on the lights. The dining room table was set for 2. Plates, forks, knives, cloth napkins folded into triangles. 2 wine glasses catching the dim light from the window. I touched one of the plates and felt a thin layer of dust, but not 3 years worth. Maybe a month, maybe less. Upstairs, the bedrooms were worse. The master bedroom had a bed made with military precision, the comforter smooth and tight, pillows arranged just so. The closet held clothes on hangers, shoes in neat rows, a jewelry box on the dresser with necklaces and rings inside. In the second bedroom, children's toys sat on shelves. A stuffed bear on the bed, books about dinosaurs and space, drawings taped to the walls, crayon pictures of houses and families and bright yellow suns. But there were no children here. No family. The realtor had said the previous owners left suddenly. No forwarding address, no explanation. Just vanished and left everything behind. And now the house was mine, with all its disturbing and unexplained contents. And I was standing in a dead child, this bedroom feeling like an intruder in my own property. I went back downstairs and found the basement door. It was locked from the outside, a heavy deadbolt that looked new. I did not remember seeing it mentioned in the listing. I fumbled with the keys until I found one that fit and turned the lock with a heavy click that echoed through the silent house. The basement stairs descended into darkness. I found a light switch and flipped it. Fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, buzzing and casting a harsh white glow over concrete walls and a concrete floor. The space was unfinished, just bare walls and exposed pipes and a furnace humming in the corner. But along the far wall, someone had built something. A room within the room. Walls made of thick plywood. A door with another deadbolt, this one on the outside. A room designed to keep something in. Or someone. My heart was hammering now, my mouth dry. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out of this house and never come back. But I had already signed the papers. This was mine now, and I needed to know what I had bought. I approached the plywood structure slowly. There were no windows, no way to see inside. I pressed my ear against the door and listened. Nothing, just the hum of the furnace and the rush of blood in my ears. I reached for the deadbolt, my hand trembling, and slid it open. The door swung inward on its own, pulled by gravity, revealing darkness beyond. I reached inside and felt along the wall for a light switch. My fingers found one and I flipped it up. The room was small, maybe 8 by 10 feet. The walls were covered in writing. Words scratched into the wood with something sharp, carved deep and frantic. They covered every inch of space from floor to ceiling, overlapping and spiraling and desperate. They are not my family. They look like them, but they are not them. Do not trust what you see. They came back different. Help me, please, someone help me. The words repeated, varied, screamed silently from the walls in letters that grew more erratic and uneven the higher they went. In the corner, A sleeping bag lay crumpled on the floor. Empty water bottles, granola bar wrappers. Someone had lived down here, hiding from something upstairs, hiding from their own family. I backed out of the room, my stomach churning, horror clawing up my throat. I had to get out. I had to leave this nightmare behind and figure out what to do, who to call, how to make sense of this terrifying and impossible situation. I turned to go back upstairs and froze. There was someone standing at the top of the basement stairs. A woman in a simple dress, her face in shadow, her posture unnaturally still. She did not move, did not speak, just stood there blocking my exit, silent and waiting. I tried to find my voice, tried to ask who she was, what she wanted, why she was in my house. But the words would not come, because as I stared up at her, she tilted her head at an angle that was wrong, too far, like a puppet on broken strings. And then she smiled. It was not a human smile. The mouth opened too wide, stretched across her face in a grin that showed too many teeth, teeth that were too white and too sharp. Her eyes were black from edge to edge, reflecting the fluorescent light like an animal, his eyes caught in headlights. I ran, not toward the stairs. I could not go toward her, but toward the far corner of the basement. There had to be another way out. A window, a door, something. My hands scraped against the concrete walls as I searched frantically in the harsh light. Behind me, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate, descending. I found a window near the ceiling, small and dirty but big enough. I grabbed a paint can from a shelf and smashed the glass. Cold air poured in. I dragged a workbench under the window, climbed up, and squeezed through the opening. Glass cut my hands. My jacket tore, but I pushed through and fell into the snow outside, gasping and bleeding and alive. I ran to my car, started the engine, and tore down the driveway spraying gravel. In the rearview mirror, I saw the house receding, its windows dark and empty again. But on the front porch, 3 figures stood in a row. A woman, a man, a child, perfectly still, watching me leave. I drove straight to the police station in Fairbanks and told them everything. The detective who took my statement listened patiently, typing on his computer, asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and told me something that made my blood run cold. The house I bought had been the site of a missing persons case. 3 years ago, a family of 3 vanished without a trace. The Hendersons, wife, husband, 6-year-old son. Their car was in the driveway, their belongings untouched, no signs of struggle or foul play. They just disappeared. And despite an extensive investigation, no bodies were ever found. No leads, nothing. The house had been in legal limbo until recently, when it was finally released for sale. The detective asked if I wanted to press charges against someone for trespassing. But against who? Against what? The things I saw were not human. They were something else, something that had taken the shape of the Henderson family and stayed in that house, waiting. I told him to forget it. Told him I made a mistake and I would handle it. He gave me a skeptical look but let me go. I never went back to that house. I walked away from the purchase, lost my deposit, did not care. But the horror followed me anyway, because 2 weeks later, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a key, the same key that opened the front door, and a photograph. It showed me standing in my new apartment in Anchorage, taken from outside my window. On the back, written in a child's handwriting, were 4 words. We know where you live. I moved again, and again. But it does not matter. Sometimes late at night, I hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Slow and deliberate. I hear a child laughing, faint and distant. I see shadows moving past my windows where nothing should be. The realtor knew. That is why she would not go inside. That is why the house was so cheap. Because some places are not abandoned. They are occupied by things that should not exist. Things that wear familiar faces and wait patiently for someone stupid enough to walk through the door. I was that person. And now I live with the knowledge that I am being watched, followed, hunted by something that will not stop. The furniture was intact because they never left. The food was stocked because they are still there, still living in that house, still waiting. And they want me back. If you ever see a house that is too cheap, too perfect, too good to be true, walk away. Do not ask questions. Do not look for bargains. Because sometimes what you are buying is not a house. It is an invitation. And some invitations come with a price you cannot afford to pay. I am writing this as a warning, as a confession, because in 2 days, I am going back to that house. Not because I want to, but because I have to. They have made it clear that running is pointless. They will find me wherever I go. The only way to end this is to face them, to understand what they are and what they want. I do not expect to survive, but if you are listening to this, if my voice reaches you through the darkness, remember what I said. Some doors should stay closed, some houses should stay empty, and some horror is not meant to be understood, only endured. Story 9. Quiet that followed the truck. The engine stopped. The silence didn't. That's what I need you to understand right from the start. When my truck died on that stretch of highway in Alaska, 300 miles from anywhere, the engine cut out, and I waited for the normal sounds to fade away. The ticking of cooling metal, the whisper of wind through the grill, the ambient hum of a world still turning around me. But none of that came. What came instead was a silence so complete, so utterly terrifying, that it made me understand something fundamental about fear. Real fear doesn't scream. Real fear goes quiet. I am going to tell you what happened that night, and I need you to stay with me because this is important. This is the kind of thing that changes how you see the world, how you understand danger, and what it means to be truly alone. My name doesn't matter anymore. Where I am doesn't matter. But what happened on that Alaskan highway in October matters. And you need to hear it. I was a long-haul trucker for 15 years. Cross-country runs, coast to coast. I'd driven through every kind of weather, every kind of terrain, in every condition imaginable. I was experienced. I was careful. I was the kind of driver who followed the rules, who checked his mirrors obsessively, who knew the feel of his rig like other people know their own heartbeat. I thought I understood danger. I thought I understood the highway. I was catastrophically wrong about both. The job that sent me north was a standard contract. A transport company needed someone to haul supplies up the Dalton Highway to a facility near Prudhoe Bay. The money was good, almost too good. And when I asked about the route, my dispatcher seemed uncomfortable. He told me the road was fine, the weather forecast looked clear, and I should make it there in about 18 hours of driving. He didn't mention anything scary or unsettling about the road. He didn't warn me about anything specific. But I noticed his hands were shaking when he handed me the paperwork. I should have asked more questions. I should have listened to that instinct telling me something was wrong. But I didn't. I loaded my truck, checked my lights and mirrors, and headed north out of Anchorage on a gray afternoon in early October. The sky was already that disturbing pale color that happens in Alaska in autumn, when daylight becomes precious and uncertain. The kind of light that makes you anxious without understanding why. The first 8 hours of driving were normal, boring, even. The kind of long, empty stretch of highway that exists in parts of America where civilization feels like a distant memory. Just me, my truck, and the road rolling out ahead in endless repetition. But around hour 9, I started noticing something unsettling. The radio stations were fading out, not just signal loss, which is normal in remote areas. The stations themselves were becoming more eerie, more disturbing in the content. News reports about missing persons, missing hunters, missing travelers, all from the same general area of highway, all from the last few weeks. I tried switching stations, but every frequency had similar content. Local news about disappearances, creepy stories about people vanishing without explanation, a man who pulled off at a rest stop and never came back, a family in a sedan who simply didn't arrive at their destination. The radio kept feeding me this nightmare fuel, and I couldn't escape it. I turned it off around hour 10 and drove in complete silence. The quiet was somehow worse than the disturbing reports. It's when I started hearing something that made my skin crawl. A sound underneath the engine noise. A kind of rhythmic thumping, almost like a heartbeat, but coming from somewhere outside the truck. I checked my mirrors obsessively. The highway behind me was empty. The road ahead was empty. But the thumping continued, keeping perfect time with the rotation of my wheels. It was maddening, the kind of noise that gets inside your head and to let go. Around midnight, I decided to pull over at a rest area I spotted about 200 miles north of Anchorage. I needed to stretch, use the facilities, maybe grab some water from my cooler. The rest area was small, poorly lit, and completely deserted. There were no other vehicles, no other people, just me and the vast, dark landscape stretching out in every direction. The kind of place that makes you feel very small and very vulnerable. I used the bathroom, and when I came back outside, I noticed something terrifying about my truck. The rhythmic thumping I'd been hearing was coming from the undercarriage. Something was wrong with the truck mechanically, but when I got down and looked, I couldn't find anything obviously damaged or broken. The thumping had stopped completely the moment I killed the engine. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. It was the kind of silence that suggested the truck itself was watching me, waiting to see what I would do next. I got back in the cab and tried to restart the engine. It turned over without issue. Everything seemed fine. I checked my watch. I was on schedule. The facility I was heading to wouldn't receive my delivery until the following afternoon anyway. I decided to push through the night and get as much distance as possible before the sun came up. That decision would cost me everything. The next 2 hours of driving were the most eerie I'd ever experienced. The road stretched out ahead in perfect darkness. My headlights cutting through the blackness but illuminating nothing but empty asphalt and occasional glimpses of dense forest pressing in from both sides of the highway. The landscape felt wrong somehow, uninviting, like the forest itself was hostile to my presence. Every few miles, I would see something that didn't quite make sense. A mailbox standing alone in the middle of nowhere. A car parked on the side of the road with no apparent reason. The unsettling feeling that something was very wrong built with every passing mile. Around 2 a.m, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road ahead. My headlights caught a human shape, perfectly still, facing away from the highway toward the forest. The figure didn't move as I approached. Didn't turn around. Didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. When I passed, I glanced in my side mirror, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. The figure's head was twisted at an impossible angle, facing backward toward the road, watching my truck disappear into the darkness behind it. The angle was so disturbing, so wrong, that I was certain the person's neck was broken. I drove faster. My hands were shaking on the wheel. My heart was hammering in my chest. The terrifying image of that twisted head kept flashing in my mind. I told myself I imagined it. The darkness, the isolation, the late hour, all of it conspiring to create something in my mind that wasn't real. But I knew what I'd seen. The fear was real and electric and completely overwhelming. I didn't see anyone else for the next 100 miles, but I felt watched the entire time. That chilling sensation of eyes on me, of something observing my progress, of being tracked. The forest on both sides of the highway seemed to press closer, the trees becoming denser, the darkness between them becoming deeper and more impenetrable. The landscape was turning into something hostile and alien, the kind of place where normal rules don't apply, where things that shouldn't exist can exist without question. The clock on my dashboard read 3:37 when I started to notice that my truck was slowing down. The engine was still running, but my speed was decreasing despite my foot being steady on the accelerator. I checked the gauges. Everything was normal. Engine temperature, oil pressure, fuel level, all showing green. But the truck continued to slow, as if the road itself was working against me, pulling at the weight, trying to bring me to a stop. By 3:45, I was doing 15 miles per hour, barely faster than a crawl. My hands were gripping the wheels so hard my knuckles were white. The fear had shifted into something else now, something more primal and urgent. I knew something was terribly wrong, something about this stretch of highway, about this place, about the very fabric of reality in this location, was fundamentally broken. The unsettling truth was becoming harder to deny. I pumped the accelerator. Nothing changed. The truck continued its agonizing slowdown. The darkness pressed against the windows. The forest seemed to lean toward the road. And then, at 3:52, the engine died. The silence that followed was absolute, complete, utterly suffocating. I sat in the cab of my truck, my hands still on the steering wheel, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and I understood that something had just changed. The world had shifted. The rules had been rewritten. I was no longer in the world I knew. I was somewhere else, somewhere terrifying and wrong. I tried the ignition. Nothing. No sound. No turning over. No attempt at starting. Just absolute, dead silence. I tried again. And again. Nothing but the horrifying quiet that refused to be broken. That's when I heard it. A sound from outside the truck. Not the rhythmic thumping from before. Something different. Something wet. Something that sounded like something was being dragged across the asphalt. The nightmare sound of flesh and bone scraping against pavement. The creepy, unsettling noise of something that shouldn't be moving across the ground toward my truck. I don't remember making the decision to get out of the cab. I don't remember consciously thinking that leaving my truck was a good idea. But I did it anyway, my body moving on pure instinct, my mind screaming at me to run, to escape, to get away from that sound. I jumped down from the cab and turned to face the direction the noise was coming from. What I saw in my headlights was something that broke my mind. It wasn't the person. It wasn't an animal. It was wrong in a way that made my brain struggle to process what I was looking at. It was vaguely humanoid, but the proportions were all wrong. The limbs were too long. The joints bent in directions joints shouldn't bend. And it was making that horrifying dragging sound with something that might have been fingers, long and skeletal, scraping against the asphalt as it pulled itself toward me with nauseating determination. I ran. I didn't plan. I simply turned and ran into the darkness. Behind me, I could hear the dragging sound becoming faster, more aggressive, more intense. The terrifying thing was coming after me. The eerie sound of its progress was closing in. My legs were pumping, my lungs were burning, and the darkness was absolute and complete. I must have run for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, before I crashed through the tree line and found myself in the forest. The darkness here was different, thicker, almost textured. I could barely see my own hands in front of my face. I kept running, crashing through undergrowth, scraping my face and arms on branches I couldn't see. The dragging sound from the road was fading, but that only made the silence of the forest more terrifying. The chilling realization was sinking in that I had no idea where I was, no way to navigate, no way back to my truck. I must have collapsed eventually from exhaustion and terror. I remember falling, crashing down onto the forest floor, gasping for breath, my entire body shaking with fear. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the forest sounds around me. Branches cracking, things moving through the underbrush, sounds that might have been animals, or might have been something else entirely. The unsettling feeling that the forest itself was alive, was aware of my presence, and was deciding what to do with me. When the sun came up, the landscape looked completely different. The darkness lifted gradually, revealing a forest that looked normal in daylight, but felt profoundly wrong. I was disoriented, unable to determine which direction the highway was. I wandered for hours, following what I thought was the direction I'd come from, but the forest seemed to be leading me deeper instead of toward the road. The trees all looked the same. The landscape repeated in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost like the forest was toying with me, preventing my escape. Late in the afternoon, I stumbled back onto the highway. My truck was still there, exactly where I left it, and standing beside it was a state trooper, lights flashing on top of his vehicle. The eerie relief I felt at seeing another human being was quickly replaced by a creepy unease when I noticed how still the trooper was. How quiet he seemed, how his hand never left his gun belt. When I approached him, he didn't turn to face me. He just stood there, staring at my truck. His voice, when he finally spoke, was wrong, flat, emotionless. He told me that my truck had been reported abandoned 7 days ago. That search and rescue had been looking for me. That the state police had been patrolling this area looking for signs of what happened to me. 7 days? That was impossible. I'd only been lost overnight. But the terrifying truth was written all over my body. My clothes were torn and filthy. My beard had grown in. My body was emaciated. My mind was struggling to accept the horrifying reality that far more time had passed than I understood. The trooper told me something else that made my skin crawl. He told me that over the last month, there had been 17 missing persons reports along this stretch of highway. 17 people, all vanishing without explanation. All their vehicles found abandoned with no sign of what happened to them. I was the first one who came back. I asked him about the thing in the road, the creature that had chased me into the forest. He didn't respond. He just stared at my truck with that same unsettling intensity. When I asked him if he'd seen anything strange in the area, he finally turned to face me. And that is when I understood the true horror of the situation. His eyes were wrong. They were too dark. They were reflecting my headlights like an animal whose eyes would reflect light. And when he smiled, his teeth were too numerous and too sharp. I don't remember getting back in my truck. I don't remember starting the engine or pulling onto the highway. But I must have, because I am here now. I drove south for the entire night, and I didn't stop until I reached Anchorage. I turned in my rig, refused the remaining payment, and got on the first flight out of Alaska that I could book. That was 3 months ago. I am in Texas now, in a small town where the landscape is flat and open, and there There's nowhere for anything to hide. But I still can sleep without all the lights on. I still check my mirrors obsessively when I drive. And every time I see a state trooper, or see someone standing unusually still on the side of the road, I feel that same terror returning. That same understanding that something is profoundly wrong with certain parts of this world. The nightmare doesn't end when you escape. The horrifying truth is that I never really left that stretch of highway. Part of me is still there, still lost in that forest, still trying to find my way back. And I think that stretch of road is still looking for me. I think the thing that chased me into the darkness is still waiting. I think it is getting closer. Last week, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, there was only silence on the line. But underneath the silence, I could hear that same rhythmic thumping sound. That same chilling heartbeat that my truck had been making on that highway in Alaska. The unsettling sound that meant something was very close. And it remembered me. I hung up the phone, but the sound didn't stop. It kept coming through, faint but unmistakable. That dragging, scraping sound of something moving toward me. The eerie certainty was settling into my bones that I had brought something back with me when I escaped that road. Something that had been waiting, watching, patient, and absolutely determined to finish what it started. The quiet that followed the truck hasn't ended. It's just waiting for me to stop moving, to stop running, to finally let it catch up. And I think that time is coming soon. I can feel it. The darkness that lived on that highway in Alaska is spreading, and eventually, it is going to reach wherever I am hiding. All I can do now is tell this story and hope that someone listens. Hope that someone understands. Hope that someone stays away from that stretch of highway. Because the creepy truth is that there are places in America where things exist that shouldn't exist. Places where reality breaks down and something else takes its place. And if you drive through one of those places, the terrifying silence that follows will never really leave you. You'll spend the rest of your life listening to it, waiting for it to break, and dreading what will happen when it does. Story 10. Alaska DIDN. To feel empty. I made a terrifying discovery in the Alaskan wilderness, and I am still trying to convince myself it was real. What if I told you that you could be completely alone in the middle of nowhere, yet have the overwhelming sensation that something is watching you? Not hunting, not attacking, just watching, waiting, patient in a way that stretches your mind to breaking point. My name is Marcus, and I was 42 when I decided to disappear into Alaska for 3 weeks. I am a commercial pilot based in Denver, and the constant pressure of schedules, weather reports, and passenger safety had burned me down to nothing. My therapist recommended wilderness immersion. Real wilderness, the kind where your phone doesn't do work and your problems can follow you. I rented a small cabin about 80 miles northeast of Fairbanks, accessible only by a 4-hour drive on roads that gradually deteriorated from asphalt to gravel to barely maintained tracks. The cabin sat on a plateau overlooking a massive valley. The silence up there wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a presence all its own, a thick, heavy presence that pressed against your ears and made you hyper-aware of every breath you took. The first few days were peaceful. I hiked, I read, I sat on the porch and watched the light change across the mountains. The solitude was exactly what I needed. By day 4, my mind had finally stopped racing. My shoulders had unclenched. I was sleeping better than I had in years. That's when I noticed something was off. I was returning from a hike around mid-afternoon when I realized I hadn't seen a single animal all day. No birds, no squirrels, no insects. The forest was completely silent except for the sound of my own footsteps. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just a quiet day. But then I thought back to the previous 3 days. I hadn't seen any animals those days either. No movement in the grass. No tracks in the dust. Nothing. I told myself it was normal. Some areas of wilderness are quieter than others. But something deep inside my chest had tightened. A small voice, the part of you that has kept humans alive for thousands of years, was sending a signal. Danger. Something is wrong. That night, I sat on the porch as the sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley below. The silence was profound, absolutely profound. And in that silence, I became aware of something that made my blood run cold. Alaska didn't feel empty. It felt occupied by something that didn't need to move. Something that had stopped making noise because it was already where it needed to be. I went inside and locked the door, By day 6, the fear had become something I couldn't ignore. I kept a detailed journal of everything I did and observed. When I look back at my notes, I realized something horrifying. The shadows weren't moving correctly. I sat on the porch from 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock, watching the light change and the shadows shift across the ground. But when I looked at my photographs from those 2 hours, the shadows had moved far too much. They shifted positions in ways that didn't match the sun, this actual trajectory across the sky. I measured it. I used my phone, this compass app, before the battery died. The math didn't work. Either 2 hours had passed in what felt like 30 minutes, or something else had happened to the light itself. The possibility that time wasn't functioning correctly up here, in this specific location, made me want to throw up. That night, I heard the scratching. It came from somewhere beneath the cabin, in the crawl space under the floorboards. But it wasn't frantic scratching like an animal makes. It was methodical, patient. 3 scratches, then a pause. 3 more scratches, then another pause, like something was trying to communicate using rhythm. I lay in bed, listening to this terrifying sound, my entire body rigid with fear. The scratching continued for 40 minutes, then stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound itself. By day 8, I made a decision. I was leaving. My original plan was to stay for 3 weeks, but I couldn't stay here anymore. The sense of being observed had become unbearable. Even inside the cabin with all the doors locked and windows covered with blankets, I could feel it. A presence, an attention, something massive and patient and utterly terrifying in its indifference to whether I lived or died. I packed my things that morning and prepared to drive back to Fairbanks. But when I stepped outside to load my truck, I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The valley below the cabin had changed. The trees that had dotted the landscape 3 days ago were gone. Not fallen, not burned, simply absent. Where they had been, there was now open ground, but the ground itself looked wrong. It looked like skin, like something had shed a layer and revealed what was underneath. I stood there, staring at that impossible sight, unable to move. My rational mind tried to provide explanations. Maybe I misremembered what the valley looked like. Maybe my perception had been altered by isolation and fear. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew these mountains. I studied the landscape from every angle of the cabin. And that valley had been full of trees. Something deep in my chest made a decision without consulting my conscious mind. I wasn't going anywhere. Driving down that single mountain road, alone, with whatever was out here watching me from the shadows and the trees and the places I couldn't see, that felt like a chilling, unsettling death wish. Maybe, I thought with a desperate kind of logic, if I stayed, if I remained still and quiet, whatever was observing me would lose interest. I went back inside and unpacked my things. Over the next 4 days, reality continued to deteriorate in small, horrifying ways. The door to the cabin, this bedroom, was suddenly on a different wall. Not moved, different. It had always been on the east wall, and now it was on the north wall, and the hinges were on the opposite side. My handprints on the window showed fingerprints that were slightly too long, slightly too thin. I hadn't touched that window since day 2. Those prints couldn't be mine. The photograph I'd taken on the first day showed 6 trees at the edge of the valley. When I looked at the same location now, there were 7 trees. A new tree had grown, or appeared, or simply materialized in that spot. It was full-sized, mature, as if it had always been there. The eerie silence continued, broken only by that scratching sound beneath the cabin. It came every night now, and I finally understood the pattern. It was counting. 3 scratches, pause, 3 scratches, pause. It was counting in groups of 3, and each night the count went higher. On night 1, it had counted to 12. On night 2, to 15. By night 9, it had counted to 37. Something was keeping track. Something was measuring time down here. I stopped sleeping. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I feel the cabin shift slightly, feel the walls adjust their positions, feel the whole structure settle into a new configuration. The horror of knowing that the space around me wasn't stable, that the laws of geometry didn't apply to this place, was enough to keep me awake through every night. On day 12, I made a mistake. I went outside to look for a cell phone signal. I'd been without communication for days. and some delusional part of my mind thought maybe if I climbed higher on the plateau, I could reach someone. Tell them where I was. Tell them something was terribly, horrifyingly wrong. The hike to the high point took about 30 minutes. When I reached the summit, I turned to look back at the cabin. From this vantage point, I could see the entire valley and the forest beyond. And that is when the chilling realization hit me like a physical blow. The valley was moving, not shifting, not changing, moving. The whole landscape was breathing, expanding and contracting with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The trees in the distance were swaying, but there was no wind. The ground itself seemed to pulse. It was like standing on the back of something alive, something vast, something that had been lying still the entire time I'd been here, and now it was making small movements, testing its muscles, becoming aware that I was standing on its skin. I ran back to the cabin. I didn't stop running until I was inside, doors locked, every light on, every window covered. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the walls for support. I had just understood something that my mind couldn't fully process. This wasn't the location that was haunted. This wasn't the place where something disturbing had happened. This was a being. The entire landscape was a single organism, and I was inside it. The scratching that night was different. It was frantic, excited, dozens of sounds at once, not just from beneath the cabin but from inside the walls. It was like the walls were alive, and whatever lived in them was celebrating something. Or perhaps it was responding to the fact that I finally understood what I was really dealing with. I spent the next day in a state of numb terror. I gathered supplies, trying to figure out my next move. I couldn't drive out. The road probably didn't lead anywhere real anymore. I couldn't call for help. I couldn't fly out. My small plane was parked at an airfield in Fairbanks, and I had no way to reach it. I was trapped in a cabin sitting on the back of something that thought in geological time, something that experienced a day the way human might experience a second. By the evening of day 13, the cabin had begun to show more obvious signs of life. The walls developed a faint pulse, barely visible, but there if you looked closely enough. The floorboards had started to feel warm, as if blood was flowing through them. The temperature inside had become constant, unchanging, the way the inside of a living body maintains temperature. I wasn't in a cabin anymore. I was inside something that had swallowed me whole and was now slowly digesting my presence. Then, on the morning of day 14, everything went still. The scratching stopped. The subtle movement ceased. The breathing sensation that had been building for days simply halted. The cabin was frozen in perfect stillness. And in that terrible stillness, I felt the attention of something so enormous, so ancient, so utterly conscious and aware that my mind couldn't contain the full weight of it. It had finished observing me. It had completed whatever measurement or analysis it had been conducting. And now it wanted something from me. I understood this the way you understand something in a nightmare. There was no logical reasoning involved. I simply knew the creature that was the valley, the forest, the plateau, the entire landscape. It wanted me to do something, to make a choice, to understand something that would change the meaning of every moment I experienced since arriving here. I looked out the window one final time. The valley was no longer breathing. It was watching. All of it was focused entirely on the cabin, on me. The trees had arranged themselves in a pattern, forming shapes that almost looked like eyes. Hundreds of them, thousands. An entire forest had positioned itself to observe this single moment. I understood then that I had been wrong about everything. The absence of animals hadn't been because the land was empty. It was because every other living thing in this region had made a choice I hadn't yet made. They had left. They had escaped, because whatever inhabits this part of Alaska doesn't live here the way animals live in other places. It doesn't kill. It doesn't hunt. It simply waits for living things to arrive, and then it holds them, studies them, and eventually offers them a choice. Stay and become part of it. Stay and let it learn what it means to be alive through you. Stay and eventually stop being separate from this vast, conscious, terrifying presence that has been here longer than mountains. Or leave, run, survive, but carry the knowledge that you were loved, in a way, by something so alien and enormous that the concept of love might have been translated entirely. I'm writing this now in my truck, 300 miles south of that plateau. I made it out. I drove down that mountain road in the darkness, and I drove faster than I've ever driven in my life. I didn't stop until I reached the lights of Fairbanks. But I can feel it still. That attention, that presence, it hasn't forgotten me. Every quiet night in my apartment in Denver, I feel it watching. Not in an angry way, in a curious way, patiently. Like it is waiting for me to understand something essential about what happened in Alaska. Like it is hoping I'll realize that it was offering me a gift, not a threat. And the scariest part? I think it might be right. Because sometimes, late at night, when the city is silent and the darkness feels absolute, I hear that scratching sound. 3 scratches, then a pause. 3 scratches, then a pause. Like something beneath my own skin is learning to count. Alaska rarely gives resolution. Most of its stories don't end. They linger. Midnight Whispers Stories is designed the same way. An ongoing series of true psychological horror shaped by isolation, silence, and real places like Alaska. When you subscribe, you're not just following one video. You're staying connected to the atmosphere, the pacing, and the stories that continue. Subscribe and stay with the series.